as an attractive jurisdiction for foreign direct investment. With that said, we have an illustrious panel who are actually going to make my work very easy. I get to ask the questions, and I'm sure they have all of the answers. And I'm going to ask them, I'm going to start at my far left, and I will ask them to introduce themselves and to just give a brief introductory statement as it relates to their viewpoints on the investment environment here in the Bahamas. Thank you. Mr. Simon.
Good afternoon. I took this seat thinking you were going to go from your immediate left, but I'm happy to introduce myself. Former CEO of the Bahamas Chamber of Commerce many years ago, also would have been managing partner of Torchkey most recently. It's a $700 million investment in the Exumas. Prior to that, I was CEO of the New Providence Development Company, an Old Fort Bay company right here in New Providence. And since July 1st of this year, another tremendous opportunity to represent my country as General Manager for Royal Caribbean International in the Bahamas and President of its pending beach club. I'm very excited to be here to participate in this. I think everybody here loves this country passionately. It's a topic in conversation that we've been having for a very long time from my Chamber of Commerce days. And I still see some of the same opportunities back then that exist today, and likewise, there are still some challenges that 20 years ago that we are still evolving. So looking forward to the conversation, so I won't be very long.
Good afternoon. My name is Felicia Woods-Hanna. I'm the Director of Investments for the Bahamas Investment Authority. I'm happy to be here with you today to report on the advancements that we have made since 2021 on foreign direct investments, the increases that we've seen in the inflow of foreign direct investments, not only in the traditional sectors, but in new sectors. So with that, I say thank you, and I hand it over.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Daniela Carrera Marquis. I'm the country head of the IDB in the Bahamas. The IDB has been a long-standing development partner of the Bahamas since the 70s, and we have a very robust portfolio of projects to help the Bahamas become more resilient, therefore less vulnerable to the climate change and natural disasters, and also to help them unlock the potential of private sector investments. We are focusing a lot on resilient infrastructure, which is something that we understand is a key to really promote the growth that the Bahamas can reach and to really bring the private sector investments that need to happen. And one of those areas is on renewable energy, which we have done quite a few advances since 2020, and that we will continue to work on those areas. I just want to say that another area that we're working on very strongly that we see as a very important asset the Bahamas has with the potential of a lot more investments is the monetization of certain real estate assets, public sector assets, including the Crown land and public sector buildings, which is a source of growth and potential that many governments across the world are looking at to open additional revenues and resources. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, guests. My name is Gershon Major. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Verizon Media Group, which is the parent company of the largest end-to-end media company in the country, with brands under its belt like Eyewitness News, Beyond the Headlines, 103.5 The Beat radio station, and Freedom March, etc. I also have the distinct pleasure of being the country general manager for Aeropost Bahamas, the largest e-commerce site in Latin America and the Caribbean, servicing over 39 countries, as well as CEO of Click to Collect Company Limited, which is the last mile that we have expanded in 7 countries with our smart locker business for e-commerce fulfillment. As we have this conversation today, and I look out to the crowd, I see so many familiar faces. I'm not going to start calling names, but it's good to be among friends and new colleagues. I want to take this conversation on investment from a different angle. I am going to be focusing on human capital investment. I truly believe that no matter how many foreign direct investments in the millions and billions of dollars a country attracts, whether it is FDI or local investment, we have to do a significant job in ensuring that the human competency, the human capacity, our ability to manage successfully those investments through how we scale our population through education, training, reskilling, and preparing for the future. So I've taken some time to look at our National Development Plan in preparation for this conversation, and will share some contextual matters that we agreed to when we first developed the plan back in 2015. So I hope to have a very engaged conversation with you, and it's a pleasure to be here. And certainly moderated by someone I've known for over 30 years. Yes, let's stick with that. Someone who I affectionately call her my sister, she calls me her brother, and her mother taught me in school and in junior high, and I probably wouldn't be where I am today without educators like her mother, so it's good to be on the panel with you, Tanya.
Thank you very much. And I think the introduction sort of laid a very solid foundation for us to really begin our dialogue. I think it's important for our delegates to understand what our national investment policy is. What are the target areas that we are looking for investment? And perhaps you can tell us whether there are areas that are reserved for Bahamians. So I'm going to direct this to Director Hannah to outline for us in a nutshell, what is the national investment policy of the Bahamas?
So the National Investment Policy was established in 1994 by the then Ingram administration. It also establishes the Bahamas Investment Authority as the one-stop shop for facilitating foreign direct investments. What a one-stop shop really means is that we are the promoters, we are the facilitators, and we are the police of the foreign direct investments into our country. In that policy, there are certain areas at the time that were considered to be reserved for Bahamians. Where there's a local capacity for Bahamians to participate in foreign direct investments, the government protects those. I will say that the national investment policy, there has been a shift. We are currently in consultations with private sector stakeholders to revamp the national investment policy. It's going to be an initiative that is not only just led by private sector, but a multi-agency approach from the government standpoint. What that means is, just as my co-panelists would have indicated, we are looking at the human capacity that currently exists in our country where it comes to services, the production of goods, as well as skill set. So which means we have to work with all of the government agencies to determine where the local capacity exists, so that when we do go through undertake to revamp the national investment policy, we review those industries that are reserved for Bahamians with a view of adding to what we have to protect our country and our stake in foreign direct investment.
Thank you very much. Daniela, what would you say, and I'll get to this so we get this out of the way, what are some of the risks, we just get this out of the way, associated with investing in the Bahamas?
Okay, I would say the first risk that you see is due to the vulnerability of the country to the natural disasters and climate change. Because this impacts the country not only because of the direct impact of the event, but also because it moves away from the fiscal sustainability objectives that the government has in order to maintain the growth, maintain debt management under control, and to avoid being in a situation where you put in jeopardy the future investments or the future generations of the Bahamas. So you have to tackle that in order to make the country more resilient. And I said resiliency in three fronts, basically. One is the resiliency that you need on the fiscal side. You need a robust country in order for the private sector to feel comfortable about investing in the long term. The second has to do with the vulnerability coming from the actual disasters and the fact that you know they will happen and that they will happen, and that has an impact, direct impact on losses and damages, but also on the potential of growth going forward. And the third has to do with how do you really make a more resilient private sector so that growth comes from the private sector. The growth should come from the private sector, not from the public sector. The generation of jobs, the generation of the skills that are needed for the future shape of the economies. So you have a small developing island country with a small population, and it's very dispersed in an archipelago. That increases a lot the cost of closing one of the most important gaps, which is the infrastructure gap that you face in the Bahamas. And Bahamas is not alone. I mean, this is very similar in many countries in the region. So our focus, because we're a long-term development agency, is to go to the areas where the private sector is not willing to take the risk, and that you should be able to close that infrastructure gap in order to foster the investment. But I would say two other things, and I'm not going to be popular by saying this, but I have to say it. The other two things that you really need for the private sector is that there is an stability on the rule of law, and that you know the laws are not going to be changing with every administration, that is in any country, so that you can have a long-term view of where the country wants to go in certain areas. And the second has to be the transparency, so that, again, you don't have asymmetries in information that can affect the pricing and that can affect the pricing for future generations.
Director Hannah, I don't know if you want to chime in. You indicated that we are reviewing our national investment policy. To what extent is resilience a key area of focus as we review our national investment policy? And what, if any, steps can we envisage being taken to mitigate some of the risks? Because within all of that, there are opportunities to mitigate some of the risks that have been mentioned.
Well, firstly, yes, the resilience is at the center of revamping the national investment policy, because the national investment policy is really the mapping for foreign direct investment in our country and how we facilitate it. So that's the first thing. The second thing, as it relates to transparency, I completely agree. There needs to be greater transparency and greater synergy between private sector. That is something that we're working on, more reporting mechanisms for not only just locally, but international agencies as well.
I'll start with Philip and then Gershon. If you would give your private sector perspective on the investment environment and what you see as opportunities.
Yeah, I think the opportunities continue to exist and expand. I can speak specifically from the cruise industry, obviously, and the reasons why that particular company and others like it choose to invest in the Bahamas. And it's not unlike any other investor. You look at some of the things that Director Hannah was just talking about, and I'll add flexibility to that, to resiliency. But the ease of doing business, the availability of competent and skilled labor force, the comparative advantage of location. We tend to take it for granted, but we remain the gateway to North America and South America, ideally situated. Diversity in culture and diversity in product offering. And then at the end of the day, the stability that we talk about, the certainty, stability in government, of course, and certainty in terms of, the rules and regulations. I think from the outside looking in those are the things that really drive people and investors to come to the country. And at the end of the day, it's really a matter of execution, right? And so we can talk more about that because I think to a certain degree, that's where some of the challenges lie.
Gershon?
From a private sector perspective, I think, as Phil mentioned, we know what some of the pillars are. Geography, certainly, being near to the largest economy in the world, being the United States of America. Our stable government and safe elections and continuity of change of administrations. We certainly have the capacity in financial service and the competency in financial service relative to our skill set among professionals. We've been leading the tourism industry for over 50 plus years with respect to the level of skills in that industry. And these are continuous and stable opportunities. I think, though, as we look to the future, we have to be very mindful about what is it that the Bahamas wants to look like in 40 years. And if we start with the end in mind, it's important for us not only to be aspirational about our success, but intentional about our success. And some of the areas that we really need to pivot is in the area of technology adoption, becoming a greater knowledge-based society, fintech, expanding in that space, and I know our moderator can have a lot to say on that because that's one of her areas of expertise. But the other area is also in the area of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. If I look at the curricula today in high schools to our tertiary level, it is what it was when I was studying. And one has to ask itself as part of its national development, is the current curricula conducive to where we want the Bahamas to go? And if it isn't, then part of the responsibility of each of you in this room, as we talk about expanding relationships, maximizing your international reach, maximizing the missions we have abroad, looking at those areas that are currently best practiced, like Estonia, in terms of e-governance, in terms of e-residency. Singapore, like a knowledge base, is known to be a knowledge-based society for years. Jamaica is now extending its educational reskilling in ICT development. Barbados is reskilling its people. So the Bahamas has to now say to itself, how do we leverage scholarship opportunities, university partnerships for the future education and reskilling of our students? How do we then expand vocational studies for those who may not be tertiary level equipped, but have the skill set to become 3-series electricians, masons for the level of construction that my good friend is going to be leading with the Paradise Beach Club. And the question I always ask him is, do we have enough Bahamians to assist with this project? Or how many foreign labor is required on this project because we don't have the skill set resident here? So we have to be very aspirational, but we have to be very deliberate in our intention. And I'll close this part with the Prime Minister made a comment in the opening of this session regarding his administration's belief and focus that the Bahamas is still one of the most attractive environments for investment. And I do agree with that. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us, particularly members of the diplomatic corps, to understand that we need to be working as a partner with the private sector on trade missions, conversations that go beyond the public sector, how we attract investment, but how we skill our people going forward.
Now, I want this to be an interactive session. I have a lot of questions, but I think some of you in the room may also have questions. So if you were to raise your name tag so that I could acknowledge you, feel free. We want you to ask some questions. Yes. Ambassador Jones.
Thank you so very much for this opportunity. I often find the need to speak with international investors in the United States of America. And from the discussion that we are having and conversations with businessmen and women in the Bahamas, we are far too Nassau-centric in looking at how we are building the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. The Bahamas lies northwest to southeast, and there are far too many islands in the southeast Bahamas that are being depopulated. And what we have is a security risk for the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, because you have islands in the southeastern Bahamas that are twice or three times the size of New Providence, with 200 or 300 people on those islands. My colleague, the High Commissioner from Canada, was the MP for Maikal, and he can tell you that all of those islands, you put them all together, we have a problem. There are far too many young Bahamians who are moving from the southeastern Bahamas, from Cat Island going southeast, coming to New Providence in search of opportunities. The question is, at the end of the day, how we are going to find employment opportunities for these young people who are leaving their places of birth, coming to the urban areas in New Providence and to a lesser extent in Grand Bahama these days, but particularly in New Providence, in search of job opportunities. We talk about pivoting, but we ought to be about finding a way to develop economies in those islands so that we are really developing the entire Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And the question that international investors ask me is, why do we need to go beyond New Providence in terms of investing in the Bahamas? Why do we go, should we go to Cat Island or Mayaguana or Inagua or Auckland or Inagua? And so I'd like for our panel here today to provide us with some ideas on what do we tell international investors about the Southeast Bahamas? Because for far too long, the development of the Bahamas has been primarily in the Northwest. And we pretend as though these islands in the Southeast Bahamas really do not exist or we do not care. And so on a beautiful island like Crooked Island, where you have 300 people, and it's perhaps one of the most beautiful islands in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, what do we do? Where are we going? Where are we taking our Bahamas in terms of growing our economy? Are we going to forever, or for the next 20 or 30 years, concentrate still on the Northwest Bahamas?
Thank you very much for that intervention. I'm going to give our director a minute to think, because I know that she is doing a lot of work with the private sector around reviewing our policy, developing incentives for particular areas, and perhaps you will want to share as well what if anything do we have in our pipeline for islands in the Southeast?
So the fact that we are an archipelago works to our advantage and makes us unique from a number of our Caribbean counterparts. That's the first thing I would say. As it relates to the work of the Bahamas Investment Authority, Ambassador, you must have read our blueprint, because what we are working on now and what we have done is increase the human capacity within the Bahamas Investment Authority to develop a promotional strategy specifically for the southern islands, but all of the islands of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. When I talk to investors, one main thing I see when they decide that they're going to invest in a particular island is that they fall in love with the culture of that island. And so when you say, and especially because you are from the southern islands of the Bahamas, I would say to you, the first thing you would do is you would promote our culture. I had an investor no later than yesterday that met with myself and the Prime Minister, who was interested in the island of Auckland. And the first thing he said to me when I asked about his interest for the island of Auckland, which is a unique one, he said that it's a hidden gem that he's fallen in love with.
If I may chime in, Ambassador Jones, I agree with you 1,000%, and many of the points the Director just raised. But I'm going to, I don't like to use the word devil's advocate, but I'm going to be an advocate to say we have to really be mindful of what it is from a vision perspective for the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. What do we want Cat Island to look like? Inagua to look like? What are the current opportunities to promote, correct? What are the current opportunities to export? And then let's build a strategic plan around that, so when we go to the diplomatic corps, we say, here are the 5 elements that relate to the Southeast. Here are the 3 elements that relate to the Northwest. But right now, if you were to ask me directly what is in the arsenal from my perspective in the private sector that I can see that I can tell you promote in the Southeast, there was absolutely nothing. There's absolutely nothing. So let's be honest with this conversation, right? I could tell you go get conch and some tourism exports and lay on the beach, but that's not scalable, nor is it sustainable, nor will it attract $100 to $200 million. My good friend here, Philip Simon, is working with a cruise line, Royal Caribbean, who's decided in their construct that they want an experience for their guests when they come in on the cruise to go to a private island and have the best beach day of their life. So they've decided they're going to invest $100+ million in that development. Now, they had a vision for an island that resides here in Nassau, just across from Paradise Island. Why aren't we developing that same for Cat Island, Inagua, Auckland, Maguana? And this is where we need to come together and put our intellectual capacity and say, here is the end in mind for the Bahamas. Every one of these islands are not going to have a Bahama or an Atlantis. There are some boutique opportunities. There's some uniqueness about the Southwest Islands, and let's structure it. Because today it doesn't exist.
To add something on those islands in particular that you're mentioning, one of the things that we are working with the government currently is to make those islands more resilient in regards to energy by building micro-solar grids in the islands so that they don't have to depend so much on oil. If you think about it, those are the most expensive islands too, in order to receive the electricity. The same thing with health and education. If we don't add to the mix, what are the digital solutions that are needed so that you can bring the public services that are required in terms of education and health on those islands, it's very difficult that you're gonna have a growing business on the private sector side. So all of these things to say that there's a building block that is about a more resilient infrastructure, whether it's physical or digital. There is a building block that is about the digitalization of public services so that the ease of doing business is improved dramatically, both for the citizens and the firms. And then there is a connectivity issue. I've been here 5 years. I've visited many islands, but every time I try to go to those islands, I can't because it would require me for a whole week to be there, and I don't have the time. So it's very difficult to if you don't have the connectivity, no? So I think that there are several building blocks that have to be met in order to have that vision that you're saying about what is it really that you're going to get on those islands.
Tanya. So, Ambassador Jones, that's, you hit it on the head, right? And I don't think we don't get the attention or the attraction. To give you a short little story, Torch Key, which is in the Exumas, formerly Hog Island, right across from Long Island. Jay Penske would have purchased that recently, and we had vigorous conversations with the department to get to an HOA and an HEA. He would have researched thousands of island properties around, and literally thousands. He would have visited 78 of them. His family obviously has very large investments here in the country. He's been coming here since he was 3. He circled the entire globe. He started in Bahamas, circled the entire globe, and came right back. And it's such a wonderful story. Came right back to the Bahamas, found that island. It was over a dozen that he investigated here locally. And so it's not that the islands don't get the attraction. I don't think so. I think there's tremendous interest, but at the end of the day, they don't get the decision. And they don't get the decision for a lot of different reasons. Forgot her name. Daniela was just mentioning some of those building blocks, because it's not simple, right? You know, so we got Hog Key down there at the lower side of the Exumas. Initially, it was a $400 million investment, and I was like, man, you're gonna have to multiply that number, right? I don't know if you're gonna multiply it by 2 or 3, but it's not as simple doing a development. Thankfully, it has a runway, it has access to a port, and it's close enough to Exuma where you can draw on a labor pool and you can draw on other advantages. But if you're gonna be developing any of those islands, especially in the South, in the Bahamas, there are some impediments to doing business that we still have to get over, and the costs and the ease, and you talk about, I mean, there's a level of decentralization that has to occur where decisions can be made, or an influence, a strong influence of decisions can be made at the local level, and not all just geared coming out of New Providence. And maybe I'm opening a Pandora's box, but it's the reality of the situation. Sometimes it just takes too long to get to some of those decisions. So I'm just simply saying, I agree with you what you're saying, because it's not happening, but I think there are some other factors that go into the decisions that kills the attraction.
Thank you very much. I know that Ambassador Mackey has a question, but I would like for Daniela, you mentioned a number of projects in the pipeline to support the government with infrastructure development. Perhaps you can share some of those, because then that helps to strengthen our position as we seek to attract investors.
So we have several projects that we're working on. One of them is renewable energy, so to support the transition to a more renewable energy matrix in the Bahamas. But with the objective, the primary objective is to create the enabling environment so that renewable energy is financed by the private sector. There is no need in these days for renewable energy to be financed only by the public sector. You do only those places where there is no financial return possible. So the objective is to get to a point that very little is needed from the public sector, and the private sector comes and finance all the renewable energy that is available. We're also supporting the government on several airports in the Family Islands, so that we can, because you face a big issue in the Bahamas. You have more than 17 international rated airports. That requires a lot of investment to get to the ICAO safety requirements. So they're very expensive as an infrastructure. But you need them because you have direct flight from many places that go directly to all the islands, and therefore you need to have investments on these airports. And the other project we're doing is supporting the physical and the digital infrastructure for the provision of health services across the Family Islands. I've been in several Family Islands visiting the clinics, and you have a scarcity of human capital to be able to provide the services, and in some cases, you would be better served by having a digital telemedicine so that you don't have to be moving the people or the experts or the patients to new province. So those, I think, those three are really directing to the public sector. But I do want to mention one in Grand Bahamas, which is we have an MOU with the University of the Bahamas and also a grant of $500,000 to create an innovation ecosystem out of the campus of University of the Bahamas in Grand Bahamas, so that you have more investors, more seed capital going into the digital space and in technology and STEAM that you were talking about.
Thank you. Ambassador Mackey, you had a question.
Ambassador McCartney, is more of an interjection because you touched on the Southeast Bahamas, which is very dear and near to my heart. You know, we said there's nothing there, and Director Hanna mentioned that, you know, the only way to get people to invest in the islands is actually get them there and fall in love with the islands. You know, we have thousands of boats that go through Exumas and Abacos and Biminis every year, but they don't get to the Aucklands, not so much Cat Island, Mayaguana. I think just a thought, you know, our country should probably put in place a ports and marinas policy where we incentivize people to build ports and marinas so you could get to these islands, Auckland and Crooked Island. If you have a port, you have a marina, the boats that are presently, and the yachts that are presently in Exuma could dock off in the Crooked Islands and the Mayaguanas. It was just today I saw the MP from North Andros. He posted that there was a cruise ship docked off, and it's the first time I've ever seen it. They had this set up in North Andros, vendors, conch salad, daiquiri. First time ever seen something like that. That's because the cruise ship was able to dock off, send the people in, and, you know, affect that community. So we could do that throughout the islands. I think if we implement a ports and marinas policy.
Director Anna?
I agree. There are a number of policy considerations that would need to take place in order to facilitate foreign direct investments into the southern islands. You mentioned yachting, boating in particular. If you go to the southern islands, there are a number of boats that are yachts, mega yachts that drift off of the southern islands. That in itself is an investment opportunity that may not necessarily need the immediate infrastructural advancements that we're currently talking about. And I go back to the culture. Understanding the culture and visiting the island will expose the investment opportunities that exist on those islands. I don't agree that there's no potential or there's a lack of potential for those islands.
Ambassador Gray, did you have a question or a comment?
Yes, thank you very much. And what an exciting discussion. I think my brother, Wendell Jones, the ambassador for the United States, he and I have a similar heritage. We both hail from the southeastern Bahamas. Now, I have a comment, if I can, and then perhaps two questions. It seemed to me that the words which import development for those islands might be just two words: anchor projects. We had a prime minister who started that vision. Of course, they put him out of office, and so it never materialized, but it's never too late. Everybody knows what I mean by an anchor project. So if an investor comes to the Bahamas to do business, more often than not, he talks to the powers that be, make connections, and then he is perhaps assisted in making his dream a reality. I could suggest, if I do humbly so, that if an investor speaks to coming to the Bahamas, he's not always channeled to Grand Bahama and New Providence, because he perhaps knows nothing about any island. So I would like to suggest that he be channeled to one of those outpost islands, if you please, that have better beaches than Nassau. And if he is given an opportunity to see those islands, one or two of them, before he is put in a catch-22, he will certainly want to consider the first investor on Acklands or Crooked Island if we could persuade him to create an anchor project. Because without people, no matter what your investment is, it's not going to be a lasting project. And if everybody leave those islands after high school, so you only have the very young, the grandchildren them, and the very old, because they have no opportunity to live and stay there. The economy is non-existent other than for public servants, police, teachers, and nurses. So they come to Nassau and other developing islands to look for a way of life. So my suggestion, firstly, would be to consider directing new investors to see some of those islands we call remote, because they ain't remote. They just haven't been shown to people to create the excitement to invest. 2, I think Danielle, I think that's the lady in the middle, she mentioned a few things that I'd like to ask about. And I know you're not policy makers, I understand that. But what if we consider the first proposition and then the one which lends itself to improved flight scheduling? I think she mentioned it. Acklands has 2 flights per week. Why in this world in which we live, we can't connect the daily flights to Exuma and allow 1 or 2 of them extra to go to Acklands and Crooked Island, because they wouldn't be really losing much time or money to connect the major islands to some of those islands that are undeveloped and make the frequency of flights available to travelers so they get to see them. When you have to go on Wednesday and Saturday, I think Danielle said, the time don't permit you to do that. But I may want to just go for a day or 2 to see what I'm hearing about Acklands and Crooked Island. But I got to spend 4 days to see it, and I could see it in 10 minutes. It makes no sense. So somebody got to, and I wish Bahamas they had somebody on that panel.
And that's a private sector opportunity as well.
Exactly.
I mean,
Look
we
at
haven't talked about
possibilities.
investment in the economy in terms of private investment or local investment, but I think that's an opportunity as well, Director Hannah, as we look at a national development plan and an investment policy.
Agreed.
Yeah? I don't know if you want to foreshadow some of the considerations that are being given to, this is to support Ambassador Gray, some of the considerations that are being given to incentivize or improve opportunities for investment in the Southeast.
Well, I'm not a policymaker, so I can't speak directly to that, and I won't get myself in trouble by doing so. But what I can say is that we are looking to revamp first of all, the biggest legislation that we have to incentivize foreign direct investors is our Hotels Encouragement Act. Our Hotel Encouragement Act was enacted in 1954, and there's only been 1 amendment to that Hotels Encouragement Act to add in an entertainment clause to it by the then Ingram administration. And so what we're looking to do is to revamp that, given everything that's happening with us trying to move to a more energy efficient country, what's happening with new developments, to see how we could further incentivize foreign direct investment in our country. Now, with that being said, maybe you, in your capacity, should lobby with the policymakers to see how we further incentivize those investors that come to or that may be interested in the southern islands of the Bahamas. The Turks and Caicos also has a policy as it relates to their economic permanent residency, where they try to incentivize foreign direct investors to go into those less populated portions of Turks and Caicos. They have a lower threshold for application for economic permanent residency. So I think we're at the juncture where we need to relook at all of our policies and the legislations that govern us and see how best we can incentivize investors to channel them to other islands beyond just the anchor projects.
And if I may, I think you're spot on. From a private sector perspective, if I were a consultant to the powers that be at a table, or I'm in the room to give advice, there's several things I would do. The first is we need to maximize public-private sector partnerships in areas to create wealth for local investment, as well as those things that we want to scale. If we're going to talk about going to Acklands, then the first thing we have to think about is, as you mentioned, flights, frequency. But when we get there, heads on beds, accommodation. When we get to accommodation, infrastructure, internet connectivity, then when we get there, we don't need power outage, so renewables. When we get to renewables, we have to think about experience, engagement. What do we do? How do we entertain ourselves? So these are opportunities for public sector and private sector partnerships that create a greater attraction for capital as well as wealth creation.
Can you tell me why the Turks and Caicos Islands, which is a part of the Bahamian chain, and further south, was able to develop the way it has, and not all of these Bahamian islands in between? Fact of the matter is that independence in 1973 at the constitutional talks in 1972, the British wanted to give the Bahamas back the Turks and Caicos Islands. It is a good thing they didn't, because the Turks and Caicos Islands would not have been as developed as they are. We have not been intentional about developing the southeastern Bahamas. Successive administrations have ignored the southeastern Bahamas. No matter that Crooked Island is prettier than some of the islands in the north, the Turks and Caicos Islands developed the way they have because people in those islands were incentivized, and the government of the Turks and Caicos Islands went about promoting the development of those islands. We do not promote the development of the southern Bahamas in our country.
I couldn't agree with you more. And you and I are on the same way.
And it's a good thing that the British kept the Turks and Caicos, because the Turks and Caicos would have been pretty much like Inagua or Mayaguana today.
Ambassador Jones, we feel your passion.
Right, but let me just close off with this, Ambassador Jones, and you're absolutely correct.
But you'll stop me, I got one more thing.
All right, part and parcel of that is one of the policies of the Turks and Caicos, which has worked exceptionally well, is that if you want to invest in the Turks and Caicos, there has to be certain local participation in ownership and equity. That's where wealth creation comes in. That's part of the incentivization of wealth creation and partnership with Bahamians. If someone is coming in with $100 million to invest in Acklands, then there should be some construct where a Bahamian partner or entity must participate. Oftentimes, we attract the capital, but the local person or the Bahamian can only work in the entity and not own the entity. Until we get serious about wealth creation and equity ownership, then these types of conversations we will just be having around each other and not with each other.
I want to acknowledge the work that is being done by Director Hannah. I'm going to share that she is actually meeting with stakeholders. There's one such meeting of which I am invited to be a part of tomorrow, to get the type of feedback that Ambassador Jones is giving so that we can inform enhancements to our national investment policy, where resources should be allocated, the islands that we ought to focus on. So I'm happy to hear that we have this passion and enthusiasm for reconsidering how we attract investment to the Bahamas. But I am going to hold brief for the director today. She didn't ask me to say that I know that a lot of what you are saying, yes, the sentiment is shared broadly, but the work and the dialogue has begun to address some of those things. I saw where Ambassador Gomez had his mic on and perhaps wanted to say something. Ambassador Gomez, and I'm going to let you have the last question from the floor because I'm mindful of the time and the fact that we are off schedule.
Right. Thank you very much, I for Tanya. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Very informative conversation. I just would like to remind my friends from Acklands and Crooked Island that business usually results from strategic studies and not from passion and other kinds of things. But I appreciate the point, and we need to develop those islands. But the Mrs. Wood Hannah spoke about the Hotels Encouragement Act, and I don't know if you're at liberty to discuss it further, but you mentioned loading it with some more benefits for foreign direct investment. Now, under the Hotels Encouragement Act, the developer of a hotel can bring all of its materials into the country duty-free.
Not all, but yes.
Well, building materials.
Some building materials.
All building materials,
Okay.
duty-free. And so, no, I've studied this Hotels Encouragement Act. We're not in Acklands and Crooked Island right now. We're in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, right? Using the Hotels Encouragement Act. So the Bahamas, let's assume, right, the Bahamas is broke before we build a $2 billion or $3 billion Bahama. We don't get 1 cent from import duties. And so I think we have to be careful with the Hotels Encouragement Act because we have these major structures going up and we have no imports or duties where we get most of a significant amount of our tax revenues. So under the Hotels Encouragement Act, we build these major structures. Atlantis, they paid probably zero into the Treasury in terms of duties on imported building materials. With Bahamas, we're talking about $3 billion probably, right? Or maybe the tax bill ordinarily would have been $300 to $600 million. We got zero. And so what's happening now in some of the private gated communities, they are classifying private residences as hotels. So even private residences in some of the major gated communities, they're now classified as hotels, and they are enjoying the benefits of the Hotels Encouragement Act. So I think the policymakers who are sitting and who are making the decisions on behalf of the Bahamian people have got to hit the pause button, because rather than load the Hotels Encouragement Act with more benefits, we've got to reduce the tax holiday, not from 100% to maybe 75%. In other words, maybe let's assume that the tax bill would have been $100, right? But under the Hotels Encouragement Act, you pay zero. So maybe you pay $25 now, not the full 100%. So you don't get a 100% tax holiday. But I think this Hotels Encouragement Act is being misused in the country by private developers of residences. If you put 2 doors in your house in a gated community, you're now a hotel. That's the deal. And so this is a problem.
I agree, and so let me explain. When I said we're looking to revamp the Hotels Encouragement Act, we're also going to look at the items that qualify. I'm working with the Ministry of Finance, first and foremost. There's never been a calculation of what we give and what we receive back. The Ministry of Finance is currently looking to put together a formula for us to determine that with every investment that comes into our country. I'm also working with the Customs Department on that listing as well. So when I talk about adding, there's going to be some subtractions as well from it. Right now, there's a discretion in the Hotels Encouragement Act as well. So when you see items listed, there's also the discretionary power by myself and the minister responsible for the Hotels Encouragement Act, which is the Prime Minister, to refuse where there's a local capacity to do so, and it does happen. However, I do feel like everything should be in writing, and therefore, what we're doing and what Dr. McCartney would have alluded to with the private sector stakeholder meetings. The tradition has always been that we form a piece of legislation and we bring it to private sector for consultation. That is not happening in this process. We're starting from scratch, and we're saying to you as private sector and all the stakeholders, public sector as well, what do you want to see that legislation look like? Also, a part of that stakeholder consultation is what works and what doesn't work. Let's have an open and a frank conversation, roll up our sleeves, and see what needs to be done to carry our country forward. I completely agree with you that when it comes to foreign direct investment, we haven't been able to accurately calculate what is the return, but we need to do so. And so we're working with the Ministry of Finance to define what that looks like.
If I may, moderator, I think it's a good idea for consultation. And I think even at the planning stage with the professional organizations like the Bahamas Institute of Chartered Accountants, the Institute of Bankers, and also the lawyers and engineers. I think all of those groups should be at the table. And then also including the diplomatic corps, because we are dealing, as some of my colleagues would have said, we are dealing on the front lines, dealing with potential investors. And we want to say to them, listen, you're going to build a hotel, but you're going to have to pay 25% of what the tax would be, so you get a 75% discount. And so I'm happy to hear that it's not all goodies going to potential investors. And this whole concept, you know, I hear about this, someone owns, there was one investor, he owns 13 islands. You pay $500 for an island and you sell them for $45 million. Like, where did this come from? Like, who made that decision? They need to get taken on Bay Street and get a cut behind, man. You know, like any Bahamian policy maker who's giving away Bahamian islands for, and then the people are turning around selling for tens of millions of dollars. It's nonsense. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Tomlinson, and I will then invite Ambassador Tom Hartley, UK High Commissioner, to also make an intervention, and then we will wrap as a panel.
I pull back, my chair. My point was made already through one of His Excellencies earlier.
Thank you, Ambassador Tomlinson. Ambassador Tom.
Thank you. I'm slightly nervous to have the last word, given the passion on the benches opposite. But I completely agree with the points made. And I spent my lunch hour going over to Atlantis for the CIF Caribbean Investment Forum conference that's happening up there. And it's interesting they're having exactly the same debate at Caribbean level about connectivity and about logistics and about the opportunities for the Caribbean market. I went over to see because there were two British companies, Virgin Atlantic and Kestrel Shipping, were presenting at a kind of regional level. But this comes on the back of recently we had a brilliant British trade mission to the Bahamas. And thank you to those on the benches on the front who made that happen, and particularly my opposite, His Excellency, the Bahamian High Commissioner to London, who worked extremely hard to make that trade mission happen as well. Many of those people left that trade mission saying it was the best trade mission they'd ever done. They were so overwhelmed by the opportunities, they were overwhelmed by the enthusiasm, they were overwhelmed by the quality of the human capital, and also of the kind of narrative, the conversations they had with the government. And they were extremely pleased they're excited by the opportunities. They will be back. They haven't been for 30 years, but they said they're going to come back next year, which just goes to make the point that there is potential when you show people the Bahamas that people want to invest. Nonetheless, they left with 3 questions, which perhaps I could pose to the panel very quickly. The first one was on customs. So whilst my friend opposite is trying to push taxes up, obviously British companies want to push taxes down. That's the debate we have globally. And whilst the UK, Bahamas, or UK Caribbean EPA is extremely competitive, and Bahamas has been great about implementing that very quickly, the government, from what I can tell, has reduced customs duty and replaced it with excise taxes instead. So although it's 0 on one list, it's now, say, 20 or 45 or 60% on a different list. And I just wondered, noting there's no policymakers on the bench, and noting Raquel Pindo is actually in Atlantis now, actually we swapped places, what the kind of government can do to communicate more clearly its tax position for companies wanting to import to the Bahamas. The second question is about debt, and whether it's about UK export finance, or it's about IDB, or CDB, or ABC. Nonetheless, all these things, it is debt, and that has to be repaid, and as cheap as it is. And it's been interesting to observe in the media, Moody's and Fitch and others who have been talking about the government's debt position. The government's revenue seems to allow a position to get taxed down to 65% over the next 10 years. Sorry, debt down to 65% over the next 10 years. That's very exciting. But there does still seem to be a hesitancy to take on sovereign debt. I just wondered if you could kind of comment, perhaps, Felicia, perhaps that's one for you, about, not as a policymaker, but what perhaps you observe as BIA about the government's appetite to be taking on debt for some of these infrastructure projects. And the third, Daniela, this might be for you, is at regional level, there feels like everyone is trying to build the new port. Everyone's trying to build the new airport. And when I was in West Africa before, everyone was building the biggest port in Africa. In Accra and Lome and Lagos, all the way up the coast, everyone was building the biggest port. But actually, they couldn't all be true. And whether in the Bahamas, Danielle, perhaps with your regional view to show you this, whether you see it as a zero-sum game, that if the Bahamas builds these new ports and new airports, of which there's significant interest from the UK to do, whether that will come at expense of only if Guyana or Jamaica or Trinidad don't build theirs, will there be capacity, or whether you feel like there's enough that everyone can build their ports and airports, and that everyone will thrive in the Caribbean. I'd be interested to get your views on that. Thank you.
Daniela, you want to start? Or you want to go, Felicia?
Can I say, while you're walking and talking, we need information in these embassies. We just don't get them. And I hope we will change that paradigm, because I could talk to investors, but we don't have the information. And without the information, you got to wing it like you know how you have to wing it, right? So let us have the information. London needs it. Washington needs it. Canada needs it. Because if we don't have the information, chances are investors will say, well, you couldn't really help me today, because I ain't gonna say I ain't gonna help you, because I didn't learn how to help you. If only to say, I'll get the information by, you know what I'm saying? But send these things out to us so we have it.
So there's 2 initiatives. The first thing is the Bahamas Investment Authority is working to make our rounds to the various embassies and consulates throughout all of the countries. That is something that's going to take some time, but nonetheless, I've already started working with a number of the different consulates. The second thing that we're working on within the budgetary constraints of the BIA, as every government agency is probably going through, we're working to get pamphlets in all of the consulates and make them readily available. That is going to take some time. We've confirmed the literature already, and so it's to government printing, and we're going to see how many we can get to all of the consulates. The biggest question is the how to, who's the first stop, and all of those items. I'd be happy virtually to assist with that in the immediate future. However, I will be coming to all of the consulates. Daniela.
So going back to the question about the airports and ports, I think there are 2 ways of looking at this. In the case of the Bahamas, There's a space to have more airports that are not necessarily international but regional. And that will make it a lot less expensive for the country to have, for example, 3 airports in Eleuthera or in Exuma. And therefore you can have some investment in the smaller islands or the further out islands that you need, if you need to improve those investments. And I do think there is enough demand for the airports throughout the whole Caribbean. Ports are different. Ports are different because you have a lot of competition, especially for cargo ports, not only from the US, but you also have Mexico and you also have Panama and other areas where you do have, if you create a super container port like the one you have in Grand Bahama, you might not necessarily have the amount of cargo to do one here and then one in Jamaica. There you will see competition, and whoever is better positioned in terms of incentives or in terms of the route or where the investments are going faster is going to have a better projection. But in terms of airports, it's slightly different. I do think also that in the case of the Bahamas, if you had better connectivity within the islands, you might not need 3 airports. No, you might need only 2 airports. And that is another way of doing it. And I do have to say this because I recently went to Cat Island, which now is my favorite island, because every time I go to a different one, that's my favorite island. And it is an amazing place. And I'm sure the rest of the other islands that are further to the south are also amazing. So I'm trying to get there. I will get there.
I noticed that Prime Minister's wife is here, Mrs. Anne-Marie Davis, and her mic is on. I want to acknowledge you, and if you have a question or intervention.
A very quick point. I'm listening to everyone, and I'm thinking one thing, numbers. Where are the numbers? Where are the bodies? That's the first point. Before any investor or anybody goes anywhere to make any investment, how are we going to get a return? Where are the numbers? Where are the bodies? So maybe Mr. Simon could get Royal Caribbean to make some ports down south. And once we get the bodies there, we can do everything else we want to do.
I'm bringing you on my promotional tour next time. Thank you so
Mr.
much.
Simon, I know
That's
you wanted...
all I wanted to say.
Thank you. I think Mr. Simon wanted to say something as well.
I did, actually, and who knows, right? There are conversations that are happening in that regard, so don't be surprised. I just wanted to say one thing, right? When we talk about investing in Bahamas, I don't know who was sitting around the table because I just reached Royal Caribbean in July. And one of the main reasons I took the position as a Bahamian was because of the structure that is employed. And I think this is what Gershon was kind of alluding to earlier. If you were there, thank you very much. Up to 49% of that development shares are reserved for Bahamians. Brilliant. 51% Royal Caribbean. Every single aspect of operations, by agreement, is pushed out to Bahamian businesses. 100% Bahamian employees is the target, starting with myself. 1% of the gross revenue goes into a fund to improve downtown attractions, tours, etc. Support for the Small Business Development Center, I know that they were here earlier. The Tourism Development Corporation is incorporated into the agreement. I don't know who did it, but I think that's a perfect model, and I say it all the time, that if we get this right as and I was, years ago when I was at Chamber of Commerce, I wasn't a fan of the cruise industry, and here I am. But if we get this model correct, I think it becomes a great template for other future investors into the country. Now, here's the problem that we have been encountering already. Scalability. So the opportunity is being presented to all of these businesses, whether it's waste disposal or energy or all aspects of operations. Great businesses that just don't have the scale or the resources to meet the existing demand. But it also represents an opportunity now for Royal Caribbean to expand its partnership with those businesses and the community. And I just wanted to say that very quickly. That's what I wanted to say.
So Mr. Simon took all of your minutes for your wrap-up, because we do have our next panel here, but I am going to ask Felicia, Daniela, and Gershon to leave one word with all of our with all of our diplomats here that would help them to articulate why foreign direct investment should choose the Bahamas. Why the Bahamas?
We're great partners. I know that's more than one word, but
Partnership.
partnership. And it's partnership not only between the government and the foreign direct investment, but you play a pivotal role in that process as well, because you're, in most instances, you are the first stop when foreign direct investors don't know where to start. And so equipping you is a commitment that we have from the Bahamas Investment Authority. I think I've taken more minutes than I was given. Thank you.
Daniela?
I would say because each island is more beautiful than the other. I think it's a great place to invest, but do take care of your environment, because that is the most important asset that you have in addition to the people that you need to take care of. If you invest and destroy the environment, you won't have a future.
We believe in our people, we believe in our partnership, and we believe in our growth. Together, that's it.
Partnership, people, location, our environment. For all of you who are out there representing our country, when investors approach you and you think of our value proposition, remember it's our people, it's the partnership between the public and the private sector, and it is our ideal location. And you might refer to the Southeast Bahamas when you want to reference location. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Put your hands together for our wonderful panelists. Thank you. So much, a very informative, engaging, and dynamic session. So we want to thank Mr. Philip Simon, Ms. Felicia Wadhana, Ms. Marquise from the IDB, Mr. Gershwin Major, and last but by no means least, the moderator, Her Excellency Tanya McCartney. So we're going to ask that you take your group photo as a panelist to the side. At this point, I'm going to make an executive decision. We're not going to coffee break. If you need to slip out and use the restroom and go to get your coffee, wonderful. But we're about to invite the other panel to come up, and we're shifting focus. They're going to do it off to the side. We're shifting focus now on the environment and climate diplomacy. The environment and climate diplomacy. And so the coffee stations are there. You can get your coffee if you need to, or go to the restroom if you need to in between, but we're going to move right into the next panel. First Lady, I think that your presence is needed over here to my right. So at this point, I'm going to invite Ms. Rochelle Newbold, who is the Director of the OPM Climate Change and Environment Advisory Unit, Dr. Rihanna Neely, Director of the Department of Environmental Protection and Planning, Mr. Dr. Carlton Watson, Professor, Dean of Pure and Applied Sciences, UB, and then Ms. Karen Panton, who is the Executive Director of the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund. To the podium, please. The moderator for this session is none other than Ms. Shameen Williams, who is head of the Economic and Trade Bureau at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. together, engage them. Feed off them, engage them. I don't want them to go this road. Then it could be hard getting them back in. Pull the rest of them inside. Aye. Right here. All of you have mics?
Okay.
Yeah? Have a mic? All right. Good. Thanks. Go ahead. Okay, colleagues, if you can be so kind as to take your seats, we're moving immediately into the environmental and climate change segment. Thank you.
They're waiting on me? Take it off my back. Getting nervous now.
They just look at us.
Okay. Good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, can I invite you to have your seats? We're going to start the next panel session. Good afternoon. Excellency, spouse of the Prime Minister, Mrs. Anne-Marie Davis, Excellencies, delegates, I bid you a warm good afternoon. My name is Ms. Charmaine Williams, Head of the Economic Trade and Sustainable Development Division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It is an honor and pleasure for me to serve as the moderator for this afternoon's session. Within the margins of the Climate Finance in the Americas panel discussion that was held 2 weeks ago, the Honorable Prime Minister noted that too many climate-vulnerable countries do not have access to the resources they need to become more climate resilient because of antiquated standards, excluding them from concessional financing. He noted that we are forced to depend on more expensive financing that severely limits the pace at which we can adapt. Delegates at that meeting also stressed the significance of the UN Multi-Vulnerability Index as a means to alleviate the current state of global financing arrangements. With this type of global situation in play, the question remains, how is a country like the Bahamas expected to holistically recover from a once-in-a-generation monster storm called Dorian that caused $3.4 billion in damage in the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama during September 2019? A solution, in part, may be derived from collaborative efforts at the regional level. Caribbean leaders have therefore banded together with a view to ensuring that COP28, that will be held in the United Arab Emirates at the end of November leading into December 2023, is transformed into a platform for genuine action, accountability, and climate finance, and climate justice. Cooperation and partnerships for climate action is deemed to be essential, as well as the mobilization for increased access to climate finance for mitigation and adaptation efforts. It is to be noted that the Bahamas was designated the regional champion for resilience, adaptation, and loss and damage at the Second Caribbean Small Island Developing States High-Level Dialogue on Climate Change. It is also to be noted that the Bahamas is preparing to send a high-level delegation to COP28 in order to deliberate on these aforementioned issues. At this junction, therefore, it is my distinguished honor to introduce you to 4 very esteemed and experienced panelists who will speak on the theme, The Environment and Climate Diplomacy, The Road to COP28. They are the persons of Ms. Rochelle Newbold, the Special Advisor on Climate Change and Director of the SIDS Unit in the Office of the Prime Minister, Dr. Rihanna Neely, Director of the Environmental Protection and Planning in the Ministry of Environment, Dr. Carlton Watson, Professor and Dean in the Pure and Applied Sciences Faculty of the University of the Bahamas, and Mrs. Karen Panton, Executive Director of the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund. Ladies and gentlemen, it is also my distinguished pleasure, before I allow these esteemed panelists to speak, to give you a brief synopsis of their wide array of experiences and expertise in this field. Ms. Rochelle Newbold has been working in the environmental field for more than 22 years. In 2022, she was appointed to the Office of the Prime Minister as the first climate change czar for the Bahamas and special advisor on climate change and environmental matters to the Prime Minister. Mrs. Newbold has been the lead negotiator for the Bahamas at COP25, COP26, COP27, and will be the technical lead for COP28 in Dubai. Mrs. Newbold was also recently appointed to the COP Bureau, a first for the Bahamas. She has represented and negotiated for the Bahamas at numerous international and regional environmental conferences and has authored and contributed to various national environmental legislations, environmental awareness handbooks, and regional and national plans, programs, and policies. Mrs. Newbold also contributed to the development of the first Blue Carbon Credit Initiative with the drafting of the Climate Change and Carbon Markets Initiatives Bill 2022 and the draft regulations. Dr. Neely. Dr. Neely is a passionate ambassador for a better tomorrow. For most of her life, she has been dedicated to service and academic excellence. But at the age of 14, she became aware of the importance of helping others to do the same. This prompted her to sign as a youth leader. It was during this time that her special ability to organize people and events became evident. Dr. Neely began her tertiary level education at the College of the Bahamas and on to Florida A&M University, where she was the first student in the history of the Environmental Sciences Institute, now the School of the Environment, to complete a degree with a focus in environmental education. She was also among the first to be chosen as a Doris Duke Conservation Fellow and a Clinton Global Initiative Ambassador from FAMU. She is presently the Director of the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection within the Ministry of the Environment and Natural Resources. She has also led the technical team in the drafting of a suite of landmark environmental legislation, including legislation that saw the creation of that department. She's involved with several environmental advocacy groups. She's involved in the church, music department, Anglican Community Band, and a president of the Royal Representatives Youth Group. My next esteemed panelist is Professor Watson. Dr. Carlton Watson has been a member of faculty at the University of the Bahamas since August 2003. An associate professor in physics, he has served the institution as the Dean of the Faculty of Pure and Applied Sciences from 2014 to 21, School Chair 2008 to 2012, and Head of Department for a year. An experimental condensed matter physicist by training, he conducts research in wide-ranging areas, including semiconductors, nanofabrication, e-learning, clean energy, and open and distance learning. He formerly served as Senior Research Scientist and Manager of the Microfabrication Unit at TLC Precision Wafer Technology in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He currently serves as Interim Executive Director at the Small Island Sustainability Research Complex with responsibility for small island sustainability programs in marine sciences, sustainable agriculture, and ecotourism. He also oversees the development of the university's laboratories to support sustainability research. He is particularly interested in policy related to land, energy, and natural resources and their impact on sustainable economic development. He has contributed to many institutional and Bahamian national committees, task force, and boards integral to national development. Last but not least, my final panelist is Ms. Karen Panton. Ms. Panton, the Executive Director for the Bahamas Protected Areas Funds, BPAF, is well known in the field of environmental conservation in the Caribbean and brings with her a solid background in conservation finance and protected areas management. Her professional career has been built on financial and accounting services to a range of stakeholders, including government entities and NGOs. She has supported environmental programs across the Caribbean, Latin America, and Mexico, while based in both New Providence and Jamaica. As Executive Director of the Fund, Ms. Patton works closely with the Board of Directors, the Governor of the Bahamas, and other stakeholders to secure sustainable financing for protected areas and climate resilience. Prior to her role with the Fund, she was the former Director of Finance and Operations at the Bahamas National Trust, serving also as the Trust's appointed Director to the Fund, to the Board. Karen was also the Director of Finance for the Nature Conservancy's Caribbean Program, as well as the financial representative for the Caribbean Challenge Initiative. While at the Conservancy, Karen served on both the best practices and the operations advisory groups. Karen completed her undergraduate studies at the College of the Bahamas. She excelled at the University of Miami, advancing to the President's Honor Roll. More recently, she attended the University of Liverpool, securing an MBA with a concentration in finance and accounting. Ms. Patton, who also served as an advisor to the Watts Institute, is an active Christian. She has one daughter, multiple dogs, and has a keen interest in nation building, connecting with people, and supporting women's interests. Ladies and gentlemen, my esteemed panelists have a wealth of knowledge and experience. Please join me in welcoming them this afternoon. Without further ado, I will turn the floor over to my first panelist, Ms. Rochelle Newble, Office of the Prime Minister. Ms. Newble, welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. So I will start with some opening remarks. As it relates to this panel, I'd like to set the stage by stating that we have one planet, and this one planet on which all of us lives is an equalizer. We don't have an option. There is no plan B. So whatever it is that we are doing that brings sustainability and an opportunity for an enriched and productive livelihood for all who dwell on this planet is in the best interest of everybody. So our previous panel talked about investment opportunities and, like they say, location, location, location. That's supposed to be, the mantra when you're dealing with real estate. But it is also said that wherever you put your money, that's where you are most committed to. So let me throw out a few facts. For more than 20 years in the UNFCCC space, we have been on a negotiation path dealing with $100 billion that is to be delivered under the agreements that have been mutually undertaken by all the countries to address the issues of climate change. And that's been more than 20 years, and we're still waiting on the full delivery in that light. However, we have spent more than $113 billion on the Russia and Ukraine war, and that's been way less than 20 years. To date, we have spent nearly $10 billion on a 19-day war dealing with Israel and Hamas. And when you throw out numbers such as those, it really brings to forebear what is it that we truly believe and are committed to as people on this planet. because the facts would show that we seem to be more interested in war, or some could say, let's be real, we're trying to prevent the spread of war. But the issue is that climate change is also just as devastating and impactful as war is, whether it is slow onset or whether it is sudden. And no country is immune to it. So when we sit together as representatives in the negotiation space, our conversations should be transparent and honest, because to be going over this $100 billion for 20 years and to see what is now materializing, it brings to bear if we're serious about this or not. So that's where I'm going to start with regards to my opening statement.
Thank you, Ms. Newell. Now I will hand the floor over to Dr. Neely. Dr. Neely, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ms. Williams. I've been in this space I've been a climate change negotiator for the Bahamas for over 10 years. And what I would like to say as an opener on behalf of where we should be looking and how we should be looking at climate change is that negotiations, and I always tell my colleagues from Foreign Affairs that I am not a diplomat. And so please do not put me on the front line to represent and speak diplomatically. But practically, COPs, negotiations, all of these things have their place. Diplomacy is very important. We need diplomacy. Diplomacy, in many instances, can help us to prevent catastrophes and the like. But when you look at the state of diplomacy, Ms. Newell spoke to the 20-plus years of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You must look at the process and you must make a decision as to, okay, what next? What should we be doing as a nation? Countries, developed countries, have promised $100 billion per year until 2030. When that promise was made, we all looked at that and we knew that that was a tall task, looking at everybody's various economies and the things that have happened since then. We look at COVID, war and rumors of wars. Countries like the Bahamas have to then look and make national decisions. The help is promised, but is it actually coming? You have to make a national decision. You have to mitigate. You have to adapt. People within your borders still have to eat. So your national plans now have to reflect what your current situation is. So we have to look at development. We have to look at adaptation for our ecosystem and what that would mean for implementation on whether we will include something like a marina or a dock or a new airport, as we were discussing in the previous panel. Are these things viable in our context? Should we be looking at the siting of new hotels along our coastlines? These are the things that we have control over, and these are the things that we need to be focusing on the national level. Of course, when grants and that $100 billion becomes available, we need to be ready to take advantage of it. But in the interim, there surely should be plans, or we need to be implementing plans that will yield fruit while we are waiting for the evidence of the $100 million that is expected and all of these other things that have been implemented. Because truthfully, other countries, developed countries, are beginning to feel the impacts of climate change in the same ways that we are. A few weeks ago, Hawaii was both on fire and flooded. So when you have to deal with those things within your own national borders, among my mother's children, I love myself the most, so I'm going to have to take care of myself before, even if I've made a commitment, I have to take care of myself before I go and look to take care of another country. And so we have to look seriously at the policies, and I think that this is where the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection comes in to provide a context for our policymakers to create those policies that will help us address climate change within our national borders in the interim.
Thank you, Dr. Neely. I'd like to turn the floor now to Dr. Watson, please.
Thank you for the invite, and I'm happy that academia is represented here. I just want to start by just telling a short story that really, there have been several events that have sort of shaped the way I think about the development and my purpose and the purpose of the university or a university, but particularly the University of the Bahamas. I remember shortly after I joined the institution, the university, I had the opportunity to travel to Samoa. It was probably in 2005. And I had an opportunity to meet with the dean of their business school, whose husband happened to be one of the minister of tourism or finance. And she started to say how they went through the Caribbean. They'd gone throughout the Caribbean, and they'd stopped in the Bahamas as well. And as a typical Bahamian, you know, we think, and we know that the Bahamas is the best place in the world. I was just delighted, and I was just waiting for her to give me her glowing assessment of all of the things that they'd done and how impressed they were with our development and the beaches and everything. And she said, we went there, but we decided that is not what we wanted for our development. That we wanted to put our university and our knowledge centers at the forefront of our development. Because a country that develops, and you could look back, country that develops without its university, without its brain trust, without its knowledge trust, is like a child or a person trying to develop without their thinking capabilities, engaged in many activities, doing all kinds of things, running from pillar to post, expending a lot of energy, a lot of time, but not necessarily moving as effectively as it should. And so I've really committed my time here. When I came home, I thought I'd be here for 2 years. And I just love a good challenge, and it's been quite a challenge. Committed myself to ensuring that we place the university in the Bahamas in the same context that other states, whether in the United States or other countries, think about their universities. And the universities have to be well-resourced. And for the university to be well-resourced, the country also has to be well-resourced. But it's also a matter of priorities. We can have all of these talks, and we had talks before, and it's great. But if I ask anyone, show me some data. What are the numbers? Where's the analysis? We would be very hard-pressed. We rely on analysis that may have been cut and paste from another jurisdiction, from another place, from a situation that's kind of similar. But in order for us to effectively advance and to address the challenges, and more importantly, the opportunities, because we are blessed with so many opportunities, but it's a matter of having the analysis, having trained the personnel who can take advantage of those opportunities. And so, you know, I don't want to take up too much time. I've been told I can speak a little long. But I would say that as we focus on the 100 billion or 10 billion or whatever numbers, that we also focus then on how we're going to then maximize the impact of those funds. And I would also say, while I am hopeful about the international community and their commitments, I've always been a person who says, or have thought, that we have to take care of ourselves. At the end of the day, and as diplomats, you are our connections to various places and various domains, and so you have a lot of work to do. But at the end of the day, I still think it's important that we put greater emphasis on self-reliance while also looking at strategic partnerships. And I will close and say that I know all of these ladies here. I'm very impressed with the work they've done, and they know my focus has been trying to get as much resources into the institution as possible so that we can grow. And I must say that I commend the previous government, and I'm really even more happy with the investments that this government and the focus that the Prime Minister has placed on climate. And so they've really been allies in helping to advance this mission in terms of strengthening the university and by extension other institutions in the country. And I think that my challenge would be to diplomats in terms of speaking for the University of the Bahamas is to how do we then leverage your connections to help build a strong university.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. I would now give the floor to my last panelist. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I must say that my beginnings were a whole lot more humble than my fellow panelists. 20 years ago, when I started in the environmental movement, I thought that environmental conservation was just making sure that we threw our garbage in the bin. And I asked my daughter today. My daughter is a lawyer, and I said to her, "What do you think of the movement?" And she said, "Mom, I had no idea your people had real work." But this is quite interesting when you think of someone who's 25, 26, and their opinion on what counts as important to the country. I'm with the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund. Our role, as we mentioned earlier, was or is to find sustainable funding for the management of protected areas and as well climate resilience, a combination of adaptation and mitigation. One of the interesting things that has surprised me, I think, in my 20-year walk is the amount of talk, and the amount of talk that happens. I resent being in meetings, and most of my colleagues would attest to this, that you call me for a meeting, I'm like, yeah, I'm coming, and then let's move for action. And this action cannot simply be depending on outsiders. I heard the ambassadors earlier, Mr. Gray and Mr. Jones, and they were talking about all of these issues that are still in our country. And the only thing I could say to myself, after 50 years, some of the conversations that we should have had, some of the progress that we should have made, what is the excuse for it? In 2019, after Dorian, we made a decision at the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund to go after funding that we were told we could not access. And that's funding from the German Development Bank, or I should say the Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, through the German Ministry for the German Development Bank. And we were told that we would never see this funding at BPAF. We were discouraged, actually. So we prepared this, what I thought was a wonderful proposal, but I do not think it was the wonderful proposal, even though I'm sure it was a wonderful proposal. We had some very excellent people working on that. But I want to say to those of us today, the proposal was excellent, but what was more so was the door that was in our faces that we had not yet knocked on. When Dorian came, we made a commitment, and we decided to go after that door that was standing there in front of us all these years. Overseas development assistance, not available to the country, because, of course, we had graduated, we had matriculated. And I said, but I know him. I know someone there in that ministry in Germany who could get some money to the Bahamas. And so I emailed him and I said, Dr. So-and-so, I need this. And he says, send me something. And I'm like, yes, it's almost ready. And I want to say to each of us, the rest is history. We've been working at the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund for about 2.5 years with funding from the government of Germany for assessments and restoration post-Dorian. Nothing is impossible. We just need to be intentional, as somebody said earlier, and we need to be committed. There are too many bright minds in this nation. Too many bright minds in this nation for us to be where we are after 50 years. We've been at the fund. The fund has been operational for about 6 years. And the things that we have been able to do, we are the only NGO in the English-speaking Caribbean with observer status at the UNFCCC. That's not just my doing. I want to say here, as I always say publicly, that it was a part of what the climate czar, Rochelle Nouveau, also encouraged. My thought, though, my thinking here is, let's be innovative, let's be original, let's bring in those young minds, our young people, and just move through those doors that are standing and saying, we won't open for you. It's just how much we knock. Ask, seek, knock. That's my reverend hat that I'm wearing as well today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Patton. I think you're reiterating the point that acts and it shall be given unto you. I'm going to come back to you in a few moments with some questions along that line with respect to external funding sources. I'm going to start my line of questions in the order that my distinguished panelists are seated. And my first set of questions, well, ladies and gentlemen, the proposed format is that I will put 2 or 3 questions to each of the panelists, give them an opportunity to respond, and then I will open the floor to you to ask some questions. And then I will proceed to the next round of list of questions that I have. To you, Ms. Newbold, let's just get right to it. What are the expected outcomes of COP28 for the Commonwealth of the Bahamas? And what are the main thematic issues for COP28 that we will be focusing on?
Well, like I said, let's get to the meat of the matter. The main issues for COP28 is associated with loss and damage and climate justice. The Bahamas, in its negotiation during the UNFCCC for the COPs, we work as a part of a group called the Alliance of Small Island States. That's what AOSIS stands for. And that comprises the 39 islands of the world. We understand that no matter what we do, we are going to be impacted by climate change. If all of us were to stop emitting every possible greenhouse gas known to mankind, we will still be the most vulnerable nations in the world to climate change. No number of engineering projects are going to address what we will be facing as individual countries. So it is, while I agree with what my colleague Dr. Neely said and Ms. Panton said, that we have to be, and we have to look internally to be self-reliant and to ensure a level of security with regards to our needs. This fight is bigger than we are. Therefore, we do indeed need the partnership of our developed partners to assist us. That goes beyond saying. We talk about Dorian and the $3.4 billion in damages, which we were impacted in a one-time event. It is October 25th, and what is the hurricane now? What is it? We done at P. If each and every time a system was to emerge and it came up the Caribbean chain and hit each of the islands as it came up, time after time after time, there is no amount of resiliency. There's no level of adaptation that will be able to assist us. And that will then lead into the issue of climate justice. Because we have 113 million refugees in the world at this time, according to the UN. We do not wish to be a part of that number. What we are trying to do is to make ourselves more climate resilient, but we cannot do that in isolation. We do indeed need the assistance of our partners, because if we don't, we will become their problem, because we will be on their shores. We will be seeking their health and their social safety net systems to be applied to us. No country wants that. So it is important for us to make sure that we engage with our partners, and like I said at the very beginning, that we are transparent in those engagements, that we are honest with one another. So that way we'll be able to plan, we'll be able to identify targets, and we'll be able to make those targets. And therefore, each party has an understanding of what to expect and what sort of adjustments to make. Like was said, a few minutes ago, we were talking about, we gotta put hotels here and airports there, we gotta spread our infrastructure, we gotta engage in more touristic activities. But what is going to address the ever-increasing sea level rise? What is going to address the fact that the level of risk, insurers are saying that we are too high a risk to put infrastructure into these islands? How are we going to combat those economic drivers that we have no control over? Those are things that hamper, and those are things that impede our ability to be resilient, to have an adaptation program that's really going to deal with the fact, because Bahamians, our population number is not stagnant. We're growing. Our children, they want a family, they want to live they want a livelihood. We all want to stay here. We love our country. We want to do what is best for us to be able to stay in this country. But the reality of it is, we cannot do it alone.
Thank you, Ms. Newbill. 2 more questions along the line of the comments that you just made. The regional insurance mechanisms initiatives that we sign on to, do we ensure that there are caveats in there with respect to disaster to protect us during the time when we may not be able to meet some of those commitments, but still be able to access them during hurricane times when we need to draw down from those funds?
Like I said, any government who knows that a situation is going to face a particular situation should put itself in the best possible way of having a plan to address it. When we engage or when we suffer the impacts of climate change, we have 2 options: get a loan or get a loan.
Yeah.
To address the infrastructural needs that have to be redressed. So we're spending a lot of time and money rebuilding, not advancing, but rebuilding, restoring what was there, and putting a lot of time and efforts into social safety nets. Because a lot of us as Bahamians, we invest in a one-time home. We're trying to pay off that bank loan so that we could stay in this house, and hopefully when we die, this will be some asset we can pass on to our children. What happened in Grand Bahama and Abaco when Hurricane Dorian took away everything? These people still had bank loans, but no assets to show for it. We saw a mass exodus of the insurance companies that left people just hanging in the lurch, and then the government had to step in to do what it could to try and engage them. I will say, nothing was more disheartening to me than working with NEMA and to see what was supposed to be the humanitarian response to the needs of the country at the time, but to find that these were individuals who were profiteering, who were seeking opportunities to benefit from the suffering that we were facing. So, hey, I'm not the one to say that everybody is altruistic in their approach. We understand that money doesn't grow on trees, and there must be a margin of profit. But what we're also saying, if these are the only partners that makes themselves available to us, we are going to be a country in a crisis in short order. And when I said we, I am talking about all the small island states of the world, because the Bahamas is not unique. We need honest partners who will broker with us. The panel before talked about our need to advance in technology. And so we would see the commitments that our developing partners are making with regards to dealing with GHGs in the transportation sector. EVs are being the new poster child for dealing with that. But what do we see happening in the Caribbean? This dumping of IC vehicles. All of a sudden, these vehicles are suddenly cheap and free and available, and we can have it at your doorstep tomorrow. This, I believe, I know it's a problem. What we need is our partners who will make available to us, like Prime Minister Motley pointed out, and she said it on the global stage. Even though we've made commitments to make these transitions, we're not being considered, nor are we being serviced by the technology holders, because our economic platform is not big enough. Profit drives everything. Wherever we see large volumes of money being invested, that's what's clearly important. And what we are realizing is that it's not climate change. It's not what's happening to these countries that are being directly impacted. And that truly needs to change, because it's the dog that's going to come back and bite all of us.
So, if The issue of moral suasion doesn't work with the quote-unquote big boys or the developed states. How are we, as small island developing states, going to ensure that this time around, the developed/the donor community will adhere to their commitments and pledges?
Dr. Neely said that, of all my mother's children, I love myself the best. And she's absolutely right. Like I said, nothing is purely altruistic. We understand that countries are experiencing floods and fires. We understand that governments have their number one priority to their nationals, right? But we also understand that there's a situation that's looming on your borders. You've made a commitment to try to help that situation. So therefore, you ought to work with those individuals to try and meet them or assist them in whatever way possible to meet that goals that stave off a flood or a torrent of issues. We see the Pacific Islanders already engaging in negotiations with Australia for swaths of land so that they will be able to move their people over to someplace else. Where you think Bahamas gonna go? We know only one place we like to go. We like to go north. Our partners in the north would like for us to stay home and deal with the matter. And I'm not one to try to be like it's all doom and gloom. I'm not saying that, because we do have some really good partners who are seeking to work with us and move things along. But the way we deal with climate finance, it's a big obstacle to be able to address the issues, to provide an opportunity for clarity. This thing about the Bahamas and its GDP being so high, oh, you're such a rich nation, we on the letter P of the alphabet. Thank God none of them came up our way, because the next one and the next one and the next one will totally put us in a different position. We were so hopeful for the vulnerability index to be developed. And when it was developed and we saw it rolled out, then we realized this is not fit for purpose. We're gonna need to look at this, because we can't have the disparity that index is putting forward as us not being vulnerable, because it's not taking into account the growing debt that countries are experiencing. Dominica has not recovered from what happened with them. And they're still trying to identify opportunities to get investors to come in and address things. We are fighting with our partners to change the methodologies and the considerations that the multilateral banks do. Because the multilateral banks, they're not interested in concessionary loans, they're not interested in the climate clauses, but these things have to be attributed to these things if we cannot continue with a business as usual model.
Thank you very much for your inputs. Dr. Neely, can you talk about the range of environmental projects that your department oversees or is responsible for, as well as can you talk about the components of the National Development Plan that relate to your ministry?
Okay, thank you. So the department is the regulatory agency for environmental planning and protection in the Bahamas. And so anything that will impact our environment nationally and even internationally, regionally, in many instances, would come through our department, whether that is a small kind of a development or whether that is legislation drafting, or it could be regional projects that we would participate in with other countries. And so the DEPP is the focal point for all of that. And so there's a wide range of things that we do on a regular basis. I must say that the work is very exciting, and we are happy to be doing our part in making sure that our environment is as best taken care of as we possibly can. And I do send an invitation to anyone that is interested in joining this fight with us and assisting with the preservation and conservation of our environment. The National Development Plan has quite a bit to say about environment. There's a physical environment, our natural environment, and the DEPP plays a role in both of those instances. We also play a role in education, because a lot of the research that is necessary, Dr. Watson spoke about the research and the innovation that is necessary to move us from where we are to where we need to be, so that our plans are science-based and science-driven. Those would also come through the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection as you're speaking about environmental research. And so all of that is a mammoth task. And I do think that we are up to the task and that we are doing an okay job. There is surely always room for improvement in what we can do and what we should be doing, and we would always look to make ourselves, a little bit better. But regulation is very important. And we have to do it whether people appreciate the regulation or not. In the absence of regulation, there is usually chaos, and that is not what we need to see here in the Bahamas as a small island developing state. Our environment is too important. It is the foundation of everything we do, and how we make our money. Tourism is our #1 industry, but without our environment, without those resources, people would not look to the Bahamas to come here. The minute our waters turn from crystal clear blue to a muddy green, our tourism industry will crash, and it is our job at the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection to make sure that those resources are well taken care of.
Okay. Thank you. On that question of keeping our natural environment pristine, what type of penalties are imposed on vessels that have had incidents or caused pollution in Bahamian waters and on the land? And secondly, renewable energy projects, is that the remit of your ministry or works, or is it a joint responsibility?
So the first question is very timely. We have before the policymakers an amendment to our legislation that will allow for us to implement spot fines to anyone that would pollute in our environment on the spot, as opposed to going through a court proceeding. As we know, in the Bahamas, our courts are very congested. They're very filled. The planning, I think we're out to 2027 right now. And so to get a case heard in environmental court would be a long time coming. And so we have now fines, spot fines of up to $5,000 that we can implement once approved through the House of Assembly in the next few meetings of the House of Assembly. We will be able to implement spot fines, like I said, of up to $5,000 to anyone that discharges illegally into our environment. And then there are various other fines that are consistent with other environmental infractions. The second part of the question was spot fines and then what? Energy. Oh, energy. Okay. With the recent cabinet shuffle, the energy has been split a bit, but the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection, Ministry of Environment, of course, still plays a major role in the implementation of renewable energy across the Bahamas. The policy is still introduction of 30% renewable energy by 2030. We are a little ways off from that target, but there are opportunities for us to bring those numbers down and close the gap. And so we are here again to ensure that this is done in a regulated environment and that our environment is better off for the implementation.
Thank you, Dr. Neely. And now I turn to Dr. Watson, the teacher, the scientist, with a sciencey question. Why are we experiencing these increasingly intense and frequent climatic events? And then secondly, how can we heighten the awareness about climate change amongst our citizens? And what can governments and diplomats do to help in this regard?
Well, I'll answer the first one as a physicist whose training is in semiconductor physics, and I have the environmental scientists behind me. But I would say this, I think it's the overwhelming consensus is, of course, the amount of carbon, anthropogenic carbon in the atmosphere, other greenhouse gases, and carbon being the #1, carbon dioxide. And of course, that has a heating, a warming effect. It creates almost like a blanketing effect from the greenhouse gases. It traps a lot of the short wavelength light that comes in from leaving, that turns into long wavelength light, which is thermal heat energy. And of course, that heats the atmosphere, the water, and that then adds more energy. So when we have hurricanes passing through. I'm being very simplistic in the explanation. But I have to say a small caveat, and I'll get in a little trouble with the environmental scientists here. We have to be very careful. There's still a debate on the frequency, because all of these are based on models, right? And the models are refining all the time. And this is another case why we need our own models, or we need to have our own scientists working with the international community to have our own sensors, our own measurement instruments, so that we can refine and get more accurate predictions and computations, models for those things, right? So there's some debate about the frequency. Or uncertainty, there's a lot more uncertainty with it. Where there's less uncertainty is the intensity, because there's a competition between the shear forces and the energy. So that there's some trade-offs. But the intensity from all or most studies have shown that is going to increase, right? So that's just a little caveat, because it's something they hear all the time. I think it's more a political statement. It's going to be more, and it's going to be more intense, but it's going to be more. It's definitely seems it's going to be more intense, which is the biggest problem, right? The intensity is the greater issue. The second part, do you want to revise my...
Public awareness.
Okay. The second part?
Public awareness.
Public awareness. I think a lot of it starts with young people. Young people have always played a role, because just with time, they become the next generation who have to pick up and address some of these challenges. But beyond that, I think there is a need, and the university and our knowledge institutions could do more in terms of how we publicize and to create a more, for want of a better word, academic citizenry, so that when you hear from the University of the Bahamas, it's not some controversy. We never have those, but just hypothetically speaking, that you start to get in tune. But what's the latest research that's coming out of what's happening? So there's some things we can do. The other thing is in our schools, we are working, so in Small Sustainability, we're working with our School of Education to ensure then that we are developing new programs. We don't have a dedicated marine science or environmental science program in the schools like BGCSEs, but we want to, I know there's an appetite for that. When we start to, even in the absence of formalized programs, when we start to educate teachers more, then they can pass it on to their students. They can see the benefits of having those in the classroom.
That was going to be my next set of questions. At the UB level, tertiary level, what type of courses are available? And what steps need to be taken for us to have environment-related courses in high school and in primary school?
Okay, so we are going through a process now of revising a lot of our programs. I'm very excited that we had a marine science program that we've gone through a major revision. I could talk all day about it because I'm very excited about it. And the next step is our environmental science program. The Small Island Sustainability came about and this is the largest donation in the university's history, $10 million, from the Freedom Foundation, Lowell Mortimer, who chairs that organization. And that gave birth to the Small Island Sustainability, the Research Center, and supporting those programs. And that has been such a blessing. We have now taken that program, and it's my belief that if we've given that level of investment, we should commit to turn that into 100 million, a billion over time, right? And so one of the things we are looking at revising, we've revised our programs, but more importantly, we know that in order for the university to really serve the country, we need graduate programs. We need the programs. We have so many young people. A lot of young, folks would say this generation is different. They're not active. I think this generation of students are more politically aware in many cases. They're still, the idealism is there, the creativity. A lot of times they're not challenged. They're not interested in you giving me 100 problems to do and work those things out. They want to be engaged in projects that they can see an impact. And we just had a project that it's going on now, I would have been there, on micros projects, and we were able to take some of our students, where we were actually measuring and taking samples, doing some analysis, and we took students along. And it was grueling work. I thought they would not like it, but they love that kind of, activity because they know and they can see the connection. And so now we move that up to the graduate level. A lot of the analysis that I've said that we're lacking, a lot of the data that we said that we're lacking, you could take one professor now, and you could have 10 graduate students with the energy now, with some level of direction, who can go on and now produce the reports that could benefit DEP, that could benefit BPAF, that could benefit forestry, OPM. And that's why I keep coming back to the role of the university and the role that universities globally, we go back to Egypt, right? They didn't have formal in the same sense, but the idea of knowledge generation and the importance of development. So that's the focus, is really growing our graduate programs.
Does the university provide, or are there any sources of funding in the Bahamas, scholarships, grants, or bonds to pursue these courses?
Well, through the government tertiary grant, most of, if I had to guess, I'd say, well, all of the full-time students, all the students who take over 12 credit hours, 90% of their tuition is covered, tuition and sometimes the books. So that has been really a blessing for a lot of students. It's really removed the barriers to education. And we don't know who that next great scientist is out there. We have now where we do need some funding, more funding, is in our programs we've built study abroad. Because we know that's the biggest thing. When I came out, and I keep hearing all the students, I want to go to the States, I want to go to Canada, I want to go to these places. If we're going to try and keep more of our best and brightest students here, we recognize that we need to also expose them to the wider world. And one way is sending them, we will send them to a university, could be in Europe, could be in China, could be in the US. And we want to raise funds around doing that. The other thing we're also doing is creating international experiences in the Bahamas. And we did that. We had the University of Delft. After Dorian, I just called up a few faculty from Delft. They know, the Netherlands have some of the best water programs in the world. And they also have a different approach from an American approach or a British approach. I think sometimes we get trapped in this is the way it's done. A part of education is looking at the entire board of what are the options and thinking about what could be how could we take this and even extend it. So we wanted our students to see a different environment. And so we've had six top professors from Delft and about 10 of their graduate students. And we created an international experience for our architecture students, which is a program that we recently, a few years ago started. And they were able to then benefit. There was an exchange of knowledge. And that's the type of thing that we want to create at the University of the Bahamas.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. Mrs. Panton, I have been advised that the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund, I don't know if it's the first or the only fund in this hemisphere to be accredited by the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. Can you expound on that and tell me what this fund does and when it was launched and established?
Sure, absolutely. So the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund was established in 2014 by an act of Parliament. However, we became operational in 2017, and then, of course, Dorian came in 2019, and we've been working with that. As I mentioned, our focus is on providing funding, sustainable funding, which is beyond 5 years or multiple years of funding, whether it's from philanthropic sources or whether it's grants, whatever it may be, for supporting partners who are actively implementing on the ground, whether it's through management plans for these national protected areas like the Bahamas National Trust, or whether it's providing the awareness and education or the research like the University of the Bahamas or Bahamas Embassy Research Foundation, or it's for policy, anything of that sort, we are there. My former chair said the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund does everything under the sun. I think she was confusing us with ZNES, but that's neither here nor there. So we are, as I mentioned, we are an observer entity at UNFCCC, which means that we are able to attend climate meetings without the necessary approval, sponsorship, or support of the government of the Bahamas. What this means is we are able to add our voices to the voices of global NGOs and lobby and advocate in a way that governments may not be able to. Through the technical innovations like smartphones and so forth, and those active voices of young people. When I was in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, I met a group of African young people, and they had all that excitement and all that drive. They wanted to see change as well, because, you know, of course it was happening in Africa. But when you're able to, and I think I'm sort of anticipating this question, but when you're able to go to these meetings, understand what's at play, and see, for example, that those countries who are the major emitters are the very ones who are also trying to avoid responsibility, it opens your eyes. You're also able to, as an observer entity, bring that information back into the country and distribute it across and to the other NGOs so that you're getting the information unfiltered. It's quite raw. You're able to send it on and say, this is what's happening, this is the position, this is the status, and so forth, from the communications that you're getting directly from UNFCCC. And I think that's been pretty helpful. Not saying that we're completely there. We are trying to get a group. I am a part of a group of conservation trust funds in the Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture. And our goal is to work alongside the governments of the Caribbean region in order to bring in private sector funding at the scale that Director Newbold mentioned and Director Neely, that would attract and make our region a whole lot more attractive, especially as it relates to mitigation, to electromobility and to renewable energy. We're too small as individual islands to do that. But with the work that we're attempting to do, and it's true, a very interesting project initiative that's financed by the Builders Initiative, we're able now to go create this sort of go-to-market strategy that is going to work alongside what the government is doing and the financing that the government is hoping to attract for these nationally determined contributions. And if I'm not incorrect, I believe the 2022 updated nationally determined contributions, in order for us to, as a country, as a nation, to make the kind of financial commitments in order to turn our country around with the 30% renewables and the 35 and 15% electromobility, it's going to cost $4 billion. There is no government budget in the Caribbean that can afford that. So there needs to be, as we've been talking about, the type of partnerships, the type of involvement and going out at all levels in order to bring that in. There's a story that says, research suggests that if the private sector uses it, the private sector should pay. So we've got hotels all over this island. We've got industry all over these islands. They're paying pittance into the protection of our, and I'm sorry, I'm not diplomatic. Maybe not quite as my friend, but the profit, I'll give you a little nugget of information. Carnival Cruise Lines makes 1/3 of their profits, don't quote me though, from the Caribbean. 1/2 of that comes from the Bahamas, which means that we are generating billions of dollars for a cruise line, for a sector, and we are receiving what? Hotels all over in our nation are here. And there's no enforcement, not because the DEP doesn't want to do it, but because they lack the capacity for enforcement. These are things we want to discuss very amicably with these businesses and suggest there is a certain amount of environmental, social, and governance good behavior that we want to encourage you, not because it's the right thing to do, but it's because it's the profitable thing to do. If we're not putting the infrastructure, if we're not protecting our ecosystems, if we're not using nature-based solutions to protect our coast, your investments are also at risk. And if we can't get them to do it in a way that says this is the right thing to do because we're good citizens, then it has to be in another way that says your investments are at risk, as are your lives, as are any one of us. I just want to leave that point.
Thank you. I have a few more questions, but I want to go to environment on the issue just raised. Dr. Neely, the challenges of governing an archipelagic state, the issues she just raised with challenges with respect to enforcement, is it manpower, resources, capacity building? What are the real issues?
It is all of the above, and some. I would like to use myself as an example. When I was in primary school and high school in the Bahamas, environmental options were not available. I learned about environmental science in university. And at that time, everybody thought that I was going to school to learn how to collect garbage. I came back home and I started teaching at the University of the Bahamas, and a student came to me crying because her mother was no longer going to pay her tuition in the Small Island Sustainability Program because it was not profitable. She could not make a living studying Small Island Sustainability. And I said to the student, would you like for me to speak with your mother? No, Dr. Neely, because she has made up her mind. And that student changed the program and studied economics. And I see her from time to time. She's still very much interested in environmental science and conservation. But the challenge is that we have to change our mindset at how we look at the environment. The environment, as I said in my opening remarks, impacts us all. Every part of our existence, the environment is the foundation of it. How we make our money, how we get our food, how we get our clothes, how we breathe, drink water. The environment is at the foundation of all of that. And for anyone to turn around and say, yes, we have to make a living, but that you cannot make a living in environment, especially in 2023, is very absurd to me. And I think that we need to do a better job, and the department is now looking at increasing its presence to make Bahamians understand that this is a viable option, that the offices that we have, they are stretched to their capacity because we have to cover from Grand Bahama to Inagua and everywhere in between. And the department is centered in New Providence. There's a lot of work to do. We're talking about the cruise ship industries, and the cruise ship industry in and of itself, you need a regulatory entity to manage them outside of any other thing that you have going on. And so there are finances that we have to compete with because we are all in the same pool of government money that is being stretched for social services and education and all of these other things. And so I do think that the government is doing its best to make sure that we are outfitted and we make use of grant funding and project funds that we would get from international and regional agencies to impact the work in the Bahamas. But there's always room for improvement. We always need more staff. We always need more resources. But so I always encourage people that think that they may be interested in this field, that this is a viable option for you, and that you would be doing a service to your God and your country in entering the field and being of service.
But are we actively lobbying for young people to pursue a career in these fields and providing the resources?
We are actively lobbying. We're working with the Ministry of Education, even at the K-12 level, to introduce the program even more prolifically to young students at the primary school level, because that's where it starts. Dr. Watson spoke about graduate students and getting teachers and all of these things. If you are in primary school and your math teacher does not like math, you will spend the least amount of time learning math in your primary school class. But if your primary school teacher loves math, you will learn to love math. If your primary school teacher is equipped, and we have various programs that we can call on in the Bahamas that assist teachers in these kinds of classrooms to empower their students to move in this direction. And so we pour into those programs as well. We participate in those programs. We help to fund those programs to make sure that you have an 8-year-old who knows This is the difference between this butterfly and that butterfly that understands recycling, that knows the importance of a mangrove. That is where it starts, and we are starting to do the work shortly to make sure that we have those 8-year-olds coming up and we hold their interest.
Thank you, Dr. Neely. Mrs. Patton, coming back to you, changing the subject a bit. How many protected areas do we have in the Bahamas, and who's responsible for the monitoring of these areas?
Okay, so we have about 120, approximately, but in terms of total area, we have 19 million acres protected, and this is terrestrial and marine through 2021, and that the declarations in 2021 were with some issues that have been resolved. The management agencies are established by the government of the Bahamas, and they include the Bahamas National Trust, their national parks, the Department of Marine Resources for marine reserves, Clifton Heritage Authority for the Clifton Heritage Park, and then of course you have the forestry unit in the Ministry of Environment for our forest estates and other forest, terrestrial estates and forests.
Thank you, panelists. I will take a break from my list of questions and open the floor to my esteemed delegates. Delegates, if you have questions, either raise your hand or your card. Ambassador Bazard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this is an area that all of us that are seated around this room understand the importance of it, because we are all in this game together. There's one planet, so it isn't just a matter of looking at small island developing states, but it's looking at the planet as a whole. One of the recurring things I keep hearing you ask the panelists is, what do you want diplomats to do? Before you can ask the question as to what do you want diplomats to do, I think there has to be dialogue and sharing of information. We are not fed the information out of any of the person sitting up there in terms of what is it that they're looking for, what is the information that we need. And I mean, because I have been in several meetings and conversations where the issue of what could we do to help the Bahamas in terms of education, in terms of grants. The EU, through their Global Gateway program, has put aside 1.69 billion euros. And for us to access it, the diplomats need to be fed the information. Furthermore, another thing that is not discussed, I mean, I sit as the ambassador with the OACPS, the Organization of African, Caribbean, Pacific States. We undertook a study because the UN was asking for input with the Multi-Dimensional Vulnerability Index. What the OACPS did, and I sit as vice chair in that subcommittee, is create not only a vulnerability index, but a resilience index, because the focus should not just be on vulnerability, but resilience. And what that does is provide the members with an argument to move forward in terms of accessing climate finance. But again, we are too siloed in order to bring any major contribution to this area. So what I would invite is that there is an open conversation, because our delegation will go to COP28, and we will know nothing about it in terms of what is coming out of there, what will be now the new focus. Has our policy shifted having been to COP28? And what do you want the diplomats, your generals as we've been called, to do out there and to bring back to assist the Bahamas in this very vital and important area? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bazard. Now I turn the floor to Ambassador Hermans.
Thank you very much. I certainly enjoyed hearing all of what was said, and certainly appreciate the passion that was applied to the conversation. What I would like to ask is, and I know that, for example, Mrs. Newbold spoke to the issue of the importation of cars, There was other things relating to construction in various locations on the Family Islands. There are two things that I wanted to speak to. One is what a level of policy is being implemented or being created to protect us in those instances. So for example, if we are being dumped on for cars, is there a policy that can be created to prevent that in the future? And is the government looking at policies of that nature to protect our environment? Even as it relates to the cruise ship industry, and I appreciate the fact that it requires a lot of resource to police. So I do understand that because there are all kinds of environmental impact assessments that need to be done, and a lot of times those things have to be imported. But that's one area. And then the other aspect of it is that given the fact that we, at some point in the future, will become climate refugees, some of the islands, and we've spoken to the experience of the Marshall Islands and the relationship with Australia for the redeployment of citizens to that location. The question that I want to ask is, given our understanding of what is going to happen in the islands, is there any blueprint which is currently being considered by the government relating to the relocation of Bahamians who will become unable to continue inhabiting the locations where they currently reside? I know this had come up even in the conversation that we had recently when the independent expert on foreign debt came to the Bahamas, and there was this question that was raised, even in terms of the utilization of IT for protection of your documentation, and all of these things. What level of conversation is currently being undertaken within the government relating to preparations for what seems to be inevitable in the future? And the final thing I wanted to speak to very briefly, because I know time is running, is the issue of the multidimensional vulnerability index. And I know that there was a comment made that our condition was not taken into account, but my question is, as somebody stated earlier, this issue of data. What type of data have we been able to develop that will allow persons making those decisions to weigh our circumstances, more particularly given the differences that exist, for example, with the Bahamas as an archipelago compared to, say, Trinidad or Barbados, or Jamaica, or Cuba, or Haiti for that matter, which are basically one land mass. And how has that data, and to what extent has it been difficult for us to create that data to allow that to be weighed adequately in the conversation? I know it's a lot of things, but anyway, thank you.
Ambassador Tomlinson, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Watson, I'm very impressed with your presentation and the work that you're doing in the schools. And actually, it struck a chord because Honorary Consul Bernard Denberg from Luxembourg over here and I were talking earlier this week about the importance of creating exchange programs with students in the schools. And so one of the challenges that he spoke to me about was that it's a great idea for kids to come here and do an exchange where they can do studies with the ocean. Because you know Luxembourg is right in the middle of Paris, Germany. Sorry. Paris, Belgium, and Germany. And so he and I were talking about that. And when you came and you talked today about taking students abroad for exposure, different things, I think that this is a conversation that you and he probably need to get together and have. That could work out great for you. And I'm sure there are other diplomats here as well who would be interested in connecting their students and so forth with your students and what's just a suggestion.
Before I go to the two distinguished ambassadors from Washington, let me just give an opportunity to the two government representatives to respond to the questions.
First of all, I would like to address the issue with the ambassadors, which you stated that y'all need data, y'all need information. You feel like you're working in a vacuum. And I say that's interesting because I know our office have been working with several of the ambassadors with regards to things that they have sought to advance on behalf of the country, and we've been very successful in accomplishing those things. I most recently point to the meeting of the Organization of American States that was held last month, where we were working with Ambassador Nemor and his team to make sure that they had the support, the technical expertise available to them to accomplish what we did, which was a landmark accomplishment in having the Nassau Declaration, the Bahamas Declaration, and the Climate Action Plan all agreed with from the hemispheric point of view. And that is very substantive. We've even given the OAS a new mandate with regards to the next 7 years coming out of the Bahamas. So yes, I clearly agree that if we are working together, we can be a powerful force. But I also want to say that while at Capitol, the technical teams may be head focused in doing what it is that we need to do, we have no way of knowing what you in your respective offices and countries that you're representing, what your needs are. And I mean, come on, we could send you COP after COP. I could send you hundreds of documentations from COP, and nobody's going to read all of that. What we need is an active dialogue where we can help you with the things that are right before you, where we can weed through and get you on the right path. Those require a give and take on both sides. So from our perspective, 5 ambassadors can attest to their intimate working relationship with us that has borne fruit from the work that they have been given. We are open to any ambassador that reaches out to us that needs our assistance. I also want to say about the issue of the transportation, Ambassador Jimenez. The government of the Bahamas sought to address the issue of transportation when we changed the law that says you couldn't bring a car in that was less than 10 years old unless it was some sort of classic, antique sort of vehicle. We had no way of knowing that the shift to EVs would have caused an influx of these IC vehicles the way we're seeing happening throughout the region. And the one thing that we know is very difficult to us is to enhance new legislation and put in new things and new policies in play. And that is something we definitely, with the new Ministry of Energy and Transportation, that is definitely something on their agenda to address forthwith. As it relates to the multi-vulnerability index and the issue of the data gap, yes, without fail, we agree. You cannot go to the Bahamas Statistical Institute and they will give you reams and reams of data. However, as I said from the very beginning, when we engage with our partners in dialogue, transparency and honesty would get us to a more effective and efficient working place than anything else. When we sit in the meeting and then they're going to say to us, we need 20 years of data in order to be able to run an analysis, my retort is, what data are you using to determine that the Bahamas is, one, too rich, too resilient, that we are no longer able to access international financing because of this issue? What are you using that makes us so strong in your position when we are saying, no, that's not correct, that information is not being adequately used, it's not fit for the purpose in which this discussion is having? I'm saying everything that comes down the pike isn't really what it is, and if we're talking honestly about it, then we can reach to a much better positioning than to say, just because you said it, that make it so. No, it doesn't make it so.
Do you want to add to that?
Yes. So with respect to reaching out, if there is any ambassador or any diplomat that would need information from us, please, we are open and willing to share whatever information that you would need. Ms. Newgold spoke to the policy on cars sometime in between 2014 and 2016. We realized that it was a problem, old cars Of course, not everybody can afford a new car from the dealership. And what we really wanted to introduce at that time was an emissions testing regime. There was much feedback, and the administration at the time decided that this was the compromise position that we would move forward with. The idea would be that a car that is 10 years or less in age, there is already some kind of emissions testing and emissions and technology incorporated into that vehicle. These cars, they're coming from everywhere, and they're landing in our country, and people, we're having a different issue with these vehicles now, because when they break down, when they are no longer useful, because the car, you could have gotten a Japanese vehicle landed in the Bahamas maybe 5 years ago for $2,500. That is very disposable cash for a lot of people. And so once the car broke down or breaks down, you can't, and the alternator costs $1,500, you put that car to the side. So we are now faced with other issues. What we're getting at now is that there needs to be a refocus into how we deal with all of our technologies, all of the waste management, all of these things that influence our climate system and the way that we live and address climate change in our borders. During the same time, between 2014 and 2016, the conversation began with what is the Bahamas going to do when it comes time for us to leave this place, or if there is a need for us to leave this place. And we were working with one of our counterparts to the north, and a recommendation of a potential place, was given to the Bahamas. And I remember very clearly that the political directorate at that time walked away from the table, because what was being proposed was something that was completely unrealistic for anyone that was born or living in the Bahamas. The placement would have been, or the area would have been somewhere in a desert that we would go. This would be our refugee site that would be designated for the Bahamas. So we need to revisit these conversations through the diplomatic channels, through the policy directorate, because these are real practical issues that we have to look at. These are live today, because we have climate migrants right now. There are many people, either national or international migrants. Abaco, Grand Bahama, not Rumkey. Is it Rumkey? The Ragged Island. Crooked Island. These people have not returned home. And this is a part of our adaptation as well, and the things that we need to put money on and to focus on to adapt. Because when you can no longer fish in Crooked Island because your house was destroyed, you didn't have insurance, and you couldn't pay to rebuild your house, you are now living in New Providence or Grand Bahama, and someone has you in a hotel making a bed. You need to retool, and the government has to pay. That is an adaptation cost now that the government has to pay to get these people to make a living. We're looking at higher suicide rates. All of these things are connected, because people now are out of place. They had to migrate, and now we do not necessarily know how we're going to treat with a lot of these people. So we still have a lot of gaps in the policies that we need to create. And through the diplomatic channels, we're saying now that these are some of the things that you can take back to your various posts when the need for a grant or opportunity arises. Adaptation looks much more different than installing a seawall or planting a mangrove. All of these adaptation costs are very important that the government has to take on. How do we retool Bahamians to work and to live in this changing environment? Fishermen across the country, people who work in water sports, all of these things, you have to now retrain and retool people to now work in the Bahamas under a changing climate and environment, and we have to pay for those costs. So we can start the conversation with those and take those things back.
If I may add to Dr. Neely real quick, I'm just excited that 3 of my directors of the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund are actually panelists. All of my fellow panelists are directors on the board of the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund. I say that only to confirm in your own minds of the quality of the board and our integrity, our accountability, our transparency, and to say to our diplomats, work with us. We are beginning a $30 million 5-year campaign for bringing in corporate and private sector partners into the fund. We're not only asking for cash, though. We're also asking for advice. We're asking for doors to be opened, the opportunities to talk about what we need. We work along with the government of the Bahamas. Their priorities are our priorities. I want to say that I know that there are some investors who may not want to put funds directly into the coffers of the government. In this case, there is a fund, the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund, established by law that is more than able and has proven itself capable of managing funding. And I'd just like to leave that, and maybe I could send on to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs a couple of the booklets that we're printing, or even electronic copies circulated to yourselves so that you know what the needs are and you can follow up with what we're doing. Thanks.
If I may, Ms. Williams.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sir.
I've heard the comments from colleagues around the table reiterating and asking for information. I think coming out of this session, it is more than clear that we need to put together an executive summary so that colleagues can be informed of the major policy issues and initiatives in summary form, so that you could be armed with the information, whether it be the Bahamas Investment Authority, what are the major incentive legislation or investment incentives that you can just list off to a potential investor, whether it be the policy priorities of the government in trade, in industry, in the environment, etc. Your call or pleas have not fallen on deaf ears. And I think after Diplomatic Week, we're going to reach out to all of the panelists for them to provide a 1-page, 2-page summary, executive summary of the main points. And we're going to find a way to correlate that into one single document and forward it on to you. I think that your request is legitimate because I have been in a position where I've traveled representing the country, did not know specifically what the government's policy was, but I had a sense and I knew where to immediately find the information, and I got it. So we will certainly try our best to arm colleagues with information so that you could be in the position to properly represent the government that you serve. And so I think it's legitimate, and we're going to ask again all of the presenters to provide an executive summary so that we can distribute it. I know that you can't get the full gamut of information, but certainly an executive summary, I think would go a long way in arming you to properly represent the government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Pinder. You hear that, panelists? You have homework. Now, I'd like to turn the floor to Ambassador Jones and then Ambassador Nemor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very informative session. I've seen a survey by marine biologists on the death of reefs in the waters of the Bahamas due to bleaching and due to climate change and the heating of our waters. This is a major problem, I believe, for food security, as many Bahamians feed themselves from fishing from the waters of the Bahamas, and our reefs are dying. I've also seen documentaries of the replenishing or planting of reefs by a group of wealthy people, some of whom reside in the Bahamas. I'm wondering if there is any consideration by the government for the replenishing or rebuilding of reefs in waters of the Bahamas to give fishermen hope due to climate change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Jones. We have several initiatives in the works on reefs in the Bahamas. We have, of course, been documenting and been paying attention to the most recent heating events. And we've also been paying attention to, prior to that, the stony coral tissue loss disease. We've been treating with limited success on that. But over the last 3 months, the reefs have really been under stress in many instances, with water temperatures recording at in excess of 93 degrees Fahrenheit. And so reefs are living species, and they require a specific temperature to live and to thrive. And once we exceed that temperature, a lot of the reefs, like many of the species that we have in our oceans, the coral species that live in those structures, they find other places to go. And so we are working with the scientists to see in lab about heat-tolerant coral reefs. So we have that ongoing. We're also looking at artificial reefs, and there's a project that I think Ms. Newbold would be able to speak more to at Atlantis on a gene bank for many of the reefs that are in the Bahamas. But there is technology, even from our neighbors to the north, that we are reaching out to them to see how we can mesh the artificial and the biological structures to help us to increase the resilience of the coral reefs to heat and to acidity in the Bahamas. And so that is something that is, the last part I spoke about is something that is pretty new. And so once more information becomes available, again, we probably would need to call on our diplomats to help us with the funding for initiatives like these. But the technology in this area is very fluid, and it's advancing. And the Bahamas is on the front lines of these. Many of the Earth's coral reefs, the healthy portions of the coral reefs, are in the Bahamas. And so we have a duty to see what it is that we can do to protect them. And luckily, where we have had bleaching incidents, we have seen the success of heat-tolerant corals in our waters. And so what we need to do now is to see how we can have those to continue to proliferate across the Bahamas and spread.
And to build off what Dr. Neely just said, so when you talk about coral reefs, you're talking about hundreds of different species that make up a reef system. And the beauty of all of this is that biodiversity is the best sort of diversity which gives strength to any ecosystem. With respect to the heat, there are certain species that can't tolerate it, and they all die. What scientists have noted is that within the Bahamas, because within Florida, which is when we first got aware of the stony coral tissue loss disease, it just went through like the plague and just wiped out reefs. When it started to pop up here in the Bahamas, we saw that it was prolific in points and areas throughout. It did not do that clean sweep of it. And so what we started to do was to identify what species seemingly were tolerant to the issue. We're tolerant to the stony coral disease, which we don't know what it is. Is it a bacteria, a fungus, a virus? Nobody knows. Or to the issue of heat stressors. And what we are trying to do now is to remove those species from the environment and put them into a coral gene bank so that if this stony coral tissue loss disease is akin to COVID, and you have this big, massive die-off, and then you have these species that can tolerate the various iterations of it, yes, we want to go back and we want to build our reefs. But we would need to put in place those that have the resiliency to survive in that environment, because what we all know is that aquariums are not the best places for reefs. It's a limited, controlled environment, but we need to make sure that what we put into the physical environment is able to thrive and contribute to our fisheries habitat, because if we lose that, not only would it be a food issue, but it also will be our reefs stand as offshore barriers during hurricanes, so that'll have another knock-on effect with respect to infrastructure that's on land. So we are trying to work through this whole thing. The world on a whole is trying to work through this whole thing, but I think the Bahamas has advanced itself in terms of its research, which includes the University of the Bahamas and the labs that Dr. Watson was speaking about, making sure that we are the masters and controllers of this asset which belongs to us, and how we seek to use it for the continued protection and benefit of the people.
And I guess I've been quiet for a while. If I must add, in terms of just a few thoughts on some of the questions earlier as well. And to be clear, I'm not speaking for government, of course, I'm academia. I think one of the things that we're really trying to emphasize is, while we recognize that we are always going to need partnerships, that we have a limited population, we have a limited GDP, that we need to play a bigger role in terms of especially those critical items. You know, a few years ago, there was a study on conch, right? And that was done by one of our partners, international partners. But to me, I can't conceive or accept that something as critical to our national identity, that research shouldn't be coming out of the University of the Bahamas. And everyone always says to me, well, why isn't the University of the Bahamas doing this and doing that? And it's just a simple answer: money, right? So we're always called on to do certain things, but at the end of the day, if you look at how the resources that the University of Florida has, a University of Miami, even if we look at the proportionality in terms of their GDP, we still could move a little higher in that regard. And so I think the way, given that we have limited funding and a lot of different competing priorities, we need to leverage more the international resources out there. And I think historically, the Bahamas has not been as good as going out in terms of getting funds. That's changing. I'm seeing that change. But you know, in the past, if you look at 10 years ago, I'd go to conferences and you'd see, or look at grant through various agencies, you'd see Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, you'd see all the countries, you'd see maybe the Bahamas has one project or something like that. And all of these, and that also, getting to that point takes money. It takes people, right? So it's not just, it's not like you could flip a switch and you change the entire environment. You need people to then plan and be architects of this. And so that's another source that we need, that we could benefit from resources, especially with our international partners. I like what Ambassador Thompson said about, exchanges. And I must admit, I am a bit tunnel vision at this point in my career in terms of the need for research exchanges more. I have this debate with a friend. He says, well, you need in tertiary, you need to start with the kids and the young people. But what is the research to show? How are you educating the young people? You could then create another generation of young folks who become older folks who are not benefited from the best possible training. And so research is going to guide, I think, a lot of what we do. And there's a need for us to be more in the driver's seat. This is our country. We don't have anywhere else to go. And so we need the resources, the support to increase the research. And I'm happy that it has been a priority, both in terms of coming out of the OPM and DEP, that the University of the Bahamas and BAMSI need to then show up and be at the table at some of these conversations. And one of the things that we're really emphasizing is our genetics lab. So we have a genetic sequencer. We have a full lab for doing extractions and the like. But to now get that next generation sequencer, and then the support, the technical support, hiring the experts to support that, that has a cost. And lastly, there was a conversation about capacity. And we know that all of our areas are stretched in terms of capacity. We know that so many of our graduates, I'm happy at OPM, at DEP, at BNT, so we need more graduates. But one of the ways we're also addressing the geographical nature of the Bahamas is we are putting more investments in terms of new faculty and new research in the areas of remote sensing and artificial intelligence. So we're now looking at, while we'll always have to do ground truthing and put people on the ground, the reality is you can now utilize the technology to do a survey of Acklands and Long Island and look at what is happening to those coastlines, or look at monitoring the species, or look at the corals. There are now folks who are looking at remotely monitoring the corals, something that would have taken maybe a year to do. If you use folks on the ground, you can now do it in a week, and it's only going to accelerate. So as much as we want to focus on some of those traditional things, we have an opportunity to now focus on being on the cutting edge. And what does that do? We talked about STEM. You're not going to create an environment where students are looking to get into STEM if they don't see opportunities, if there's no reward. Korean students are not, or Chinese students are no brighter, inherently brighter than Bahamian students or any other students. They've just built an economy that requires that their students, if they want to get good jobs, that they need to know some mathematics and they need to know some science. If their economies were only tourism and at the most entry level, they wouldn't inherently, I don't believe, be as good as, quote unquote, good as they are in that. So as we build a society that requires more knowledge, we also create that push for students and the younger generation to acquire that knowledge. And
Can I just, really quickly? I want to make one more note on this, and following up from Dr. Watson. We need to create avenues for our young people to have businesses. It's not just jobs anymore. I know people half my age who have 3 sources of income, and I'm extremely embarrassed because I should know better, but they want to create wealth. So when we're talking about opportunities, and there are opportunities in the environmental sphere for wealth creation, for wealth management, and we need to demonstrate and say to them, you're not only going after a job, but you're going after your life. You're going after a career. You're going after something that is going to be honorable, but it will also generate the kind of satisfaction and wealth that our young people want these days, because they're not like us anymore. They're very short-sighted. What's in it for me? Here's something in it for you. You can develop that business. You can become an environmental lawyer. You could become, I don't know, a marine lawyer, or give me some clues. But the point is, let's not just settle with jobs. Let's settle with wealth creation. That is where we need to start in order to generate that kind of enthusiasm that our young people need to go into these areas of STEM.
Ambassador Nemore.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and I will try to be as brief as I can because I know it's late in the afternoon. I'd like to, first of all, publicly thank the technicians and the experts, and in particular the Office of the Prime Minister's team. Ms. Newbold can attest, and I offer a public sense of gratitude to the team working with the Permanent Mission in pulling together the 2 recent climate action meetings. And I do want to say exactly, if anybody wants to pursue this path of pulling together these types of meetings, this endeavor started December of last year. And we had meetings every 2 weeks up until October. And so the technical team were there, and we walked it all through. So I want to extend certainly a level of gratitude to the team. In May of 2021, while I served as the ambassador to the United Nations, my team, I'd submitted, and Ms. Williams was a part of that as well, I had prepared a bespoke measurement, an MVI, for the Bahamas. Put in all of the components, because what we saw from what I had seen from the AOSIS submission, they had redundancies, they had gaps, and it goes to the earlier issue in respect of lack of data, the paucity of data. there were proxies within this, and it still exists, that there are a number of proxies, particularly when it comes to the Bahamas. So you would end up with the final result of a vulnerability measurement that does not truly capture the Bahamas, nor does it capture the individual islands of the Bahamas. So that's one thing. So I had committed to circulate it, recirculate it, and for the team in the diplomatic field, for them to also take a look at it, because it's not something that is too complex to read, because there is, I tried to lay it out, there are components, and once you look at the components, you yourself can determine, this doesn't apply, this applies to the Bahamas, but it's not properly reflected. There was a component called remoteness, and they said the Bahamas was not remote because it was close to Florida, close to the United States, hence it's close to a market. But when we talk about remoteness, we're talking about the southern islands of the Bahamas that does not have the ability to get services on a recurrent and consistent and reliable basis. The question, and I think the issue that was raised by the professor from the University of Bahamas in respect of grant funding, just again using the same exact scenario of what we had for the project with the OAS. The permanent mission raised $600,000 of grants. And what we found, again, we had to write a concept paper. It's really the requesting nature of the grant, and nobody was going to give the Bahamas a grant. Nobody was going to give the permanent mission a grant. What they gave the grant to was we cast it as a regional, a hemispheric project. The minute I went through the door of these international agencies and I said, the Bahamas would like to, and they was like, oh, well, the Bahamas can pay. So I said, well, the rest of the organization are members of the Organization of American States. This is a hemispheric endeavor. On the matter of of us possibly becoming, likely becoming climate refugees, I served as the special envoy to the Secretary General of the OAS. We came down and we had a conversation and we said, oh, a lot of people that encountered Hurricane Dorian found it quicker to get on a boat and get to Florida than it was for you to get on a plane, because the airports were damaged. There was no way to get out. And the closest point of departure and the closest port was Florida. And a few of them at the time, thought that I was still with the Embassy of the Bahamas, and so I'd spoken with a number of people. They had called me, and they had said, well, I understand that there is a facility. It was called a temporary protected status. And the temporary protected status applies to, I think it's about 16 or 17 countries. The only country in the Caribbean it applies to is Haiti. But technically, it is for natural disasters, but the Bahamas doesn't qualify for it. When you drill down, it's because the assumption is we have the ability to not only pay for our citizens, is for us to also evacuate our citizens and put them on another island. But that's an assumption you're working with, and so the temporary protected status was not applicable to us, and probably would not likely be applicable to us, because it's for poor countries and war-torn countries, and we don't fall in that category. There's also the question about the recovery factor that's always missing. The Bahamas does not have, the CDB uses something called a recovery duration adjuster. And they found out that the Bahamas, for you to recover from a hurricane, it's not a one-to-one scenario, a ratio. It doesn't take a hurricane to happen this year and then the next year you recover. The pattern for Dorian, I think, is 7 to 10 years recovering. So, there are a lot of factors and acuteness that applies to the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And I think we need to be in a position to be able to articulate what is the peculiarities associated to us, what makes us not only different, but what makes us vulnerable and what makes us susceptible to hurricanes. The hurricanes that hit us are more frequent and more intense. You can get struck with a hurricane every year, but we get struck with hurricanes that are more frequent and more intense. And there was a question, I think, in respect to the accommodation regarding the foreign students, if we are going to do these exchanges. That always comes up. We tried to do something with the OAS and said we're going to do a reciprocal arrangement, and it turned out that we weren't able to offer the accommodations. So, thank you very much for the time, Madam Moderator.
Thank you, Ambassador Nemor. Before I go, Lady Davis, I see you. Before I go to you, Ambassador Nemor comments were very instructive with respect to the MVI. And I want to ask you, Ambassador Nemor, may I infer that we're heading into a COP28 advocating for an MVI where the actual criteria and what it constitutes is not actually finalized?
I mean, again, I'm not a part of the negotiating team, so I leave that to the negotiating team. But
Yeah.
if we were placed in a position to ask what is it that we'd like to have in the MVI, we'd make sure that those proxies are accurate, make sure that the redundancies are removed, and make sure it reflects the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. So we're not Bermuda, we're not Barbados, and we're not Belize, we're the Bahamas.
It's okay. So, Ms. Newell, MVI is a big talking point for us going into COP28.
Yeah, but MVI, just to be clear, COP28 isn't the begin all of the negotiations. We've been talking about the MVI for the last 2 years, right? And we're still talking about the MVI. And as Ambassador Nemor said, we have pointed out this fact that there are abnormalities, there are differences that needs to be captured by this index if we're going to use this as a global indicator as to how we are responsive to countries' needs. And the response that have come back from the consultants assigned with it, well, there are too much variabilities. That's impossible for them to be able to capture all of those things. But this is life. That's the reality of it. So if there is a broad area and then you put it down to each individual country that then takes on those differences to come out with that number, that's what needs to be done. And we have to be transparent and honest about that. And that's what we've been advocating for.
Thank you, Madam Davis. Is your light on? No? Sorry.
Well, I was following everything, and I'm particularly interested in the coral that we had damaged over a period of time, because I think that's part of the seabed that absorbs the carbon, something like that, you know. But I wanted to say thank you to Ambassador Pinder, and I want him to include me along with the diplomats when he's giving out his information, because I too need an update. And yes, I thought about Coral Vita when you were talking about the coral and replacing some of the damaged coral or seeing how best you could replace it. I thought about Coral Vita and whether they are impactful at all in repairing coral and replacing it, because they're doing a lot of work in that area. In Grand Bahama. So I wondered if that plays, what sort of role they play in this. And I got my answer about the marine protected areas, about the Bahamas protected areas. I got my response on that when Karen here spoke. So, but the only thing I wondered still is whether Coral Vita is playing any role in helping us with the coral replacement. I know they do a lot of work with the spiny coral down there. They said that they replaced quite a bit of coral so far. So I don't know if what impact they've had on helping in that area.
Thank you, First Lady Davis. Coral Vita is a player in the space, but Coral Vita is more of a commercial player in the space. Coral Vita would, for example, if there is a development that has been given permission to dredge or to have an impact on our on the seafloor, and coral reefs would be impacted, Coral Vita would be an agency or a company that a developer would be able to reach out to see how they can replace in the numbers that we would specify corals, the specific corals that need to be replaced and where they should be sited. Coral Vita has a very limited role in the research or academic space, although there is an opportunity for them to to use some of their commercial and business know-how to influence what's happening in the research and academic space. And we, of course, encourage them to be more of a bigger player in that space. But for right now, they are more on the commercial side. And so they have an impact. They are able to grow coral on their facilities and outplant coral in places that need coral, but it is on a commercial basis.
And just to add to what Dr. Neely has said, it's akin to what the analogy that the former panelist said, that if you have 2 doors on your house, now you want to claim the Hotels Encouragement Act. Corals are a natural resource that belongs to the people of the Bahamas. Anybody seeking to gain access to that resource for an intent of profit must come to the government for permission and for a partnership to be established such that the Bahamian people receive a direct benefit. And that is something that we need to be moving forward with. And, beforehand, we were allowing people to come in, they want to do research, they hit on something, and then they just took off, not remembering that they needed to come back for approval. You invite them over for dinner, the food tastes good, next thing you know, they're in the kitchen cooking up things, right? And that is how we're 50 years old now. We have some resources, some that are under threat, some, thank God, has been newly discovered and looks very profitable in terms of having a direct benefit to the people of the Bahamas. We now become the controllers and managers of our resources.
Okay, great. So I understand. So they need permits and they need to work. Okay, so I understand. I didn't realize they were all on their own on a commercial basis. Because they've invited me a lot to a lot of their activities, mangrove planting, mangrove mania. I've been with them a lot, so.
So anyone that would want to do that kind of work in the Bahamas, replanting mangroves, outplanting coral, would need a research permit from the Bahamas government. And you will get that through the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection. And that is also accompanied by something called a mutually agreed terms. The mutually agreed terms outlines exactly what the commitment is by the researcher or by the commercial entity in a commercial math sense, and what the Bahamas government's responsibility is. And we hold them to those clauses, and if you break any of those clauses, there are liabilities associated with those clauses on the academic side as well on the commercial side. And so anyone that would need to do any kind of research in our environment would need to have a research permit, and under different circumstances, you would sign a mutually agreed terms that would outline what your commitments are and what we expect from you as a researcher or as a commercial entity.
Can I just clear up just one little thing for First Lady Davis? Carl Vita and Waterkeepers Bahamas work very closely together. In fact, Carl Vita gave them a portion of the land allotted to them by the Grand Bahama Port Authority for mangroves farm. So a lot of the mangroves work that you have championed has been through that relationship with Waterkeepers. So I just wanted to make sure that Carl Vita wasn't getting in any trouble with the government of the Bahamas.
So, just to be clear, you're telling me that Coral Vita is not really sanctioned by the government to operate, despite being recognized by the government, despite winning awards globally for the work they're doing in the Bahamas, and despite winning the £1 million from Prince William himself, or King Charles himself from England? So you're telling me they're operating illegally in the Bahamas?
You all hear me when I say I wasn't a diplomat the first time? Coral Vita would have been acting with under certain permits from the government of the Bahamas to do what they were doing, yes. Coral Vita is in a position right now where it is requesting to do coral outplant at a commercial level, and they have at this time no approval to do that. Okay, they have permission from the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection and Department of Marine Resources to perform certain duties, to perform certain activities with respect to corals. And I think it is under those permits that they would have put proposals together to the Duke and the Earthshot to receive those awards that they would have received, I think, last year. So there are several things happening with Coral Vida in the Bahamas that we could, if you would like some further information, we could have a side conversation on.
Yeah, I think so. That's very interesting to me, coming from Grand Bahama and seeing the work that Coral Vida does and the recognition they get from both the government and from the private sector. Because when you talk about the land that they were given out in the east, that land was given, was an agreement both between both partners, the government and the Port Authority. So for you to tell me now that they're basically a commercialized entity who really isn't totally legit, I'm like, oh, okay.
I guess we could just say Coral Vida have a very strong and effective marketing team, right? They're selling a product, they're putting it out there, and people are picking it up.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and tiptoe away from that subject. Two final questions before I ask each of my distinguished panelists to do a very quick wrap-up because we have exceeded our time, and I'm very pleased because the conversation has been very engaging and productive. The road to COP28. We can't effectively have our national priorities advanced if we're not at the negotiation table. What environmental bodies, international committees are we members of? That's the first question. And at the actual COP28 summit, are we walking armed with investment-ready, bankable projects to present to the developed community?
Well, on the first question about what boards or committees that we are part of, you know, the Bahamas has the distinct honor of having the Prime Minister act as champion for loss and damage and climate finance. So his voice has resounded throughout the world about the importance of making sure that these things are thoroughly addressed, that it's a fit for purpose application, and that vulnerable countries are taken into account. And secondly, with respect to the fact that we have focal points associated with IRENA, with the Bureau, with IPCC. We have behemoths that are representing on strategic agencies that have interaction or input into the COP output process. So we are well placed, and I know some people complain about the level of travel that they see the Prime Minister do. Out of sight, out of mind. If he is not there to champion the cause, if they are not hearing from your head about this importance, then they will push your matter aside. So that is very important for us, that we have representation at the table. And what was your second question, just to make sure?
Are we walking with bankable, investment-ready projects to present to the International Committee at COP?
Definitely. We have several projects that the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Energy and Transport has, as well as we have projects associated with our youth. We talked about the youth and the education process, so we definitely have those. And we have investment projects that the Bahamas government wishes to put forward in the international community to bring forward adaptation and resilient projects and programs to come back at home.
I do not want Ambassador Pinder to come on the stage a second time to me. So at this point, distinguished panelists, I'm going to invite you to do a very brief 1-minute wrap-up of today's session. I'm going to start with you, Ms. Newell. Go ahead.
Well, I hope, I see that we have gone overpass and late, and I'm hoping that our partners that would have been here from the other diplomatic countries would have heard our cry and our request for a transparent and honest negotiation so that we can move forward with some of the things that are still on the table to be resolved when we go at COP28, notably loss and damage and issues associated with climate justice.
So I will end as I began. There is surely a place for diplomacy in climate change, but there comes a time, and I think we are at the time where we need to balance strike a proper balance between diplomacy and national action, and understanding that there are certain things that we have to now do for ourselves, because although help has been promised, help will more than likely not come in the way that we anticipate that it will land. And so that we need to, so that our people do not suffer, so that we do not continuously increase debt. Of course, if there's a storm and there's no other way to react or respond, we may have to get into debt. Diplomacy has its place. We have to remove our heads from the sand and enact and ensure that we have national policies that will assist us in the way that we need assistance in the years to come.
I just want to reiterate, as I've, in almost every space, I speak about the role of education research in the university. And to those ambassadors or representatives, I should say diplomats, international, that the University of the Bahamas, I think, is one of the best investments. And I will be talking to my colleagues here as well. I'm constantly talking to them, but I believe the university is the best investment of how you advance a country, because through our advancement, we can further strengthen the other institutions. More scientists for depth, more research that they can rely on. We're working constantly now with the forestry unit, and not to go on a tangent, but I find it, I think it's, how do I say it diplomatically? The forest, we have so much forest space, and when you look at the level of resources they have to man the entire archipelago. And so, as it sounds as if I'm focusing internally on the university, really I'm talking about all institutions. We can have the private sector, we can have NGOs, but we need strong government institutions and private institutions to move the country forward. And so we want to work with partners where there's an opportunity to bring private sector and academia, government and academia, international linkages, because the university can serve as a hub, a neutral party that transcends governments, and that could have the stability to help move the country forward for another 50 years, another 100 years, another 200 years.
Just want to say that, often those of us in the non-governmental sector complain about not having a seat at the table and not being in the room when these discussions are being held. But I want to say thank you to Ambassador Pinder and to the team that brought this together, and certainly inviting the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund into the space. The whole question of data, capacity, partnering, collaboration, having ambition, being intentional, deliberate, urgent, is what I want to leave with us today. There is so much more that we can and should be doing. We just need to have that ambition and that courage to put our foot forward in this space. And that cannot come just by one island alone, one island nation alone, but it's by being there. What I see Director Newbold doing and Director Neely doing, just being in the space, just being collaborative with other small island developing states and going out there and representing our interests. We cannot stop climate change. We cannot stop being climate refugees, but we could delay it. That is what I think is the opinion. And as we delay it, we want to make sure we maintain that quality of life that Bahamians have come to enjoy. So stay woke is what they would say as we move forward in the path together.
Thank you very much, distinguished panelists. If I could also, the moderator's prerogative to summarize what I've heard here today, and to summarize for our audience who are still listening, I would say the message from the Bahamas to the world on the road to COP28 is as following. We need your advocacy and lobbying support. We need your commitment to the plight of SIDS. We need your support for an MVI index, at least in principle. We need your pledges for the Loss and Damage Fund and other funds to be adhered to. We need your support for debt structuring and debt forgiveness, as well as the expansion of special drawing rights eligibility. We need your support for the significance of capacity building initiatives and the significance of we've learned from academia with respect to the importance of environmental sciences. On that note, I wish to thank all of you, my distinguished ambassador who put together this important theme, my distinguished panelists, Lady Davis, Excellencies, delegates, thank you very much for your presence here today. Good afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Ms. Williams. Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you, diplomatic colleagues, for remaining in place. And if you think that our foreign ambassadors are not engaged and listening, they very much are. And I hope that everyone benefited from these sessions. I most certainly have learned quite a bit about the government priorities and some of the issues that we face in the environmental and climate change space. And so this has been a very long day. It has been a very fruitful day, I believe, and very beneficial. Thank you so much for your engagement. Just by way of information, today brings to an end the joint plenary between the Bahamian and foreign delegates, and tomorrow is entirely with the heads of missions, and that is our overseas resident Bahamian ambassadors and all of our consul generals. We meet tomorrow, and of course, the non-resident ambassadors, you are invited because you never know if there would be a shift and when you would be posted overseas. The information, I think, is invaluable. And so all of our Bahamian diplomats are welcome to attend that session. It begins early morning as a breakfast session at 8:30. And to our foreign delegates, you are free for most of tomorrow. Bear in mind your aides and your drivers are assigned to you and they are available to you. And so you can take advantage of shopping, you can take advantage of roaming around the hotel. They are with you. And then we will reconvene jointly tomorrow evening at 6:30 here at the Bahamas Resort for the naming ceremony of the George Patrick Stewart Library of Foreign Affairs. And that will be here at the Bahamas Resort. That begins at 6:30. And then immediately following that short ceremony, we will have the foreign minister's reception. And we will feed you and dine you, wine and dine you like we always do in good spirit and in good, very eloquently, we believe. And so that concludes today. Once again, thank you so much for your kind attendance and your participation. God bless you all. Pardon me? Absolutely. Absolutely. We will certainly take our photo, and I think that, Ms. Williams, you've already started. I'm hearing an executive summary coming from your panel, and I'm sure you're going to get some additional information from all of your wonderful panelists, just highlighting the main points that our ambassadors need to know from their respective areas. photographer.
Whose case, Ambassador? Thank you so much.
Very well, my pleasure.